Let's get peppy. Welcome to PEP 218. This is PEP or Planet Extra podcast. I am a host of Planet America on ABC Australia, Chaz Lichadolo, and this is an unofficial podcast of the ABCs. On PEP, we cover all the stuff that's too nerdy for TV. If you're listening, you can find us on YouTube at the PEP with Chaz and Dr. Dave channel, and you can also see highlights on the PEP Clips YouTube channel. And we're on Facebook at the Chaz from Planet America channel. You also find timestamps and show notes in our blurbs, and if you leave a comment under our current episode video, we are likely to see it. You can also tweet us or blue sky us at PEPCHASDRDAVE. That's at PepChazDrDave. If you want to chat to some fellow peppers, you can join our Discord server. It's on the screen now or in the blurb of the podcast. But if you want to contact me or Lockie the Lucky privately, why not email us? The address is producer at pepthepodcast.com. That address again is producer at pepthepodcast.com. Also, why not subscribe to the YouTube? Yeah, I never ask people to do that. I should ask them every now and then. Just subscribe. We don't have many. And we're recording this at 11:50 a.m. on a Tuesday when the news about Iran has just changed again. Oh, my God. But for now, let's turn to our special guest, Pepper. The lady who was going to be Melina Mondays doing extras, but then all of a sudden we have so much more to talk about other than the extra Melina. Melina Wicks. Hello, Melina.
Hello. I was going to say I love that after going to so much effort in the last podcast to make Melina Mondays branding stick, we have ended up recording on a Tuesday.
Yes, we have. Do you have a middle name that starts with T? Like, can we work with this?
Unfortunately
No.
not.
You can probably hear my voice isn't fantastic. I do actually have influenza A, which is the reason I'm recording this from my house at the moment. You can see why we're using Zoom, me and Melina, which is a shame because I would like to be in the office of Melina for her first ever in our new studio, Pep. That is a shame. But look, bear with me. I know my voice isn't fantastic and could say some very sick person type things because I am quite sick. I am quite feverish. This could be an interesting trip. First of all, though, Melina, what are you grateful for?
Yeah, I'm gonna go a little bit off script and do not a grateful but an appreciation, if that's all right, which is I would say a cousin of a grateful. Which you're gonna hate, but because I have to say we've known each other a long time. And I've followed your work even before then, and I've had many occasions over the course of that time to marvel at your brain and how much you know about US politics and general knowledge and pop culture and all kinds of things. But I've got to say, I think never have I been so astonished by your wealth of knowledge than in the last PEP when Dr. Dave made a Flintstones reference and you off the top of your head just casually mentioned Fred's boss's name as Mr. Slate. Like, it's just, everyone just knows that. I'm like, what? How is that just to hand in your brain at this moment? I was very impressed. So I appreciate your just endless knowledge for all things pop culture.
You know, normally I don't like compliments, but I'll take a compliment about pop culture. That's the kind of compliment I can take. It's funny because I am constantly astonished by what Dr. Dave carries around in his brain. But what he carries around in his brain is academic stuff and facts and trivia and historical details from like 1824. Some person did that. That's what he carries around in his brain, whereas I carry around in my brain Flintstone references. I think that's the difference between me and Dr. Dave. That's okay. What I am grateful for, I know now we're on the ABC, I shouldn't be listing any brands in an explicit advertising form, so I won't do that. We can mention brands, but I shouldn't go buy this decongestant. But I am super grateful for decongestant technology. I know, Melina, you've heard me say this many times before in person. I'm not talking about the saline ones. Forget them. I'm talking about the ones with the heavy duty chemicals that when you spray them, bang, your nose, like in seconds, is completely clear. I That to me is right up there with the space program. I think that is mankind's greatest invention in the 20th century. I think it's so good, and I'm so grateful for it. And most medicine, it either when you take it and go, is this a placebo effect? I'm not sure this is making a huge difference, at least for me. But that decongestant, there is no doubt. There's no placebo there. It's just take it and bang. If you're not aware of those decongestants that you get at the chemist, but explicitly with the chemicals, not with the saline, then please, the next time you get a blocked nose or a cold, go and check them out. Because they've been around for like 40 years, but I'm surprised how many people don't know about them. They are so good. And I am super grateful because I would not be doing this podcast without it. I assure you. So, guys, that's what I'm grateful for. Correspondence. Got a little bit of correspondence up the top here. And we'll have a little bit more later on. And like I keep on saying, after the holidays, we'll have a lot more. I'm going to go through the emails properly. But first of all, there's no doubt. There's something I have to mention right at the top. We've had so much correspondence about the bleeping of the swear words or swear words in the last PEP. People went nuts. So, for instance, Robert... shouldn't have said last name. Robert said, it's already here. The heavy hand of the ABC. Yeah, just bleep the last name. I just said that ironically. It's already here. The heavy hand of the ABC. Do we really need to beep? Is that fascism, Dave? After I put out the call for, is that fascism sting? I thought that was very funny. Look, I feel a little bit sorry for our supervisor that he's not here right this moment. He's going to hear this after we record it. And because we're recording this at a weird time. And I rang him up like literally 5 seconds before we're recording going, that's swearing. And he's like, And we will talk about it. Like he didn't want to. He made the point that the reason for the bleep was because we're going through the ABC complaint system, and some people do get offended by that kind of stuff. And he said he preferred to not have to deal with ombudsman complaints, which is fair enough. This is something that we're going to be discussing though, and see if we can work our way around it. Some people suggested a content warning at the top, so then no one can complain. I mean, it's not like we get blue here. Just every now and then, Dave just gets, he's like Blackadder, just with slightly juicier language. He just gets a bit fruity, that's all. So hopefully we can work our way through it. I certainly have taken loud and clear that you guys don't like it. I get that. And we'll see if we can get to the bottom of it. If we can't deal with it, well, sorry. But I did actually, if you recall, when we first talked about this, I did actually flag this back back in our old studios. I did say possibly the only issue might be swearing. I could see that coming. So far, I think that is the only issue, literally the only issue. Like we're working our way through getting the extras in. We were going to have Melina Monday. And apart from the extras, that was the only, that was going to be the only issue. So that may be our only one issue. The bleeping might annoy you guys. But hopefully we'll be able to work our way so we don't have the bleeping. But if we do, we do. I'm not going to walk over that. That's a silly thing to walk over. So, but I do register your annoyance. Grateful correspondence. This is my grateful from last week. I was grateful for women not being killed. That's in the context of sex selection.
And was that controversial?
Well, no, it wasn't people. There was no one who was actively campaigning for women to be killed. But Wednesday did note any preferences for baby girls is about exploiting the caring duties foisted upon us. Men mostly don't and aren't expected to look after their children and their aging parents. Women do it, often caring for their children and their parents and or their husband's parents at the same time, while also holding down paid employment. And outsourcing says, is a shift in gender attitudes really progress, or in Asian countries like Japan, are parents just betting on daughters as safer long-term carers? So that's a general theme from a couple of commenters. Way to yuck my yum, guys. Well, look, okay. I can't talk about Japanese culture, okay? I don't know a lot about it. But the first thing I would say is this was worldwide. It wasn't just Japan, okay? This was, we were citing countries in Africa, countries in Europe, countries in America. This is around the world. And not every country has a culture of the kids looking after the parents. So I do question that for that reason. But in the context of your Japan or your China, countries which have a sense of filial responsibility as part of their culture, I don't know. Maybe. What do you think, Melina?
Yeah, I did think a similar thought after listening to that. And the other thing I thought is if you, over a long enough period of time, have a bias towards the number of boys being born, at a certain point, that becomes problematic. And that has been a talking point when people talk about demographic challenges in a lot of the countries you mentioned, that once boys start to outnumber girls in meaningful numbers, then they grow up into men who can't find women to marry and have kids with. And so at a certain point, having women becomes more valuable again, because if you're, particularly if you have a culture that, puts a value on, which, let's be honest, most do, the kids getting married and having children, grandchildren, care, which, I think that some countries have more developed, institutionalized care systems for older people, but still, like, a lot of work falls on the kids of elderly relatives regardless, and that is generally disproportionately borne by women everywhere in the world as a kind of a rule, as an average. So yeah, those were the kind of two thoughts I had when I was listening to that. But yeah, I do wonder whether having a single man who can't find someone to marry and have kids with has become less desirable, and therefore the kind of cachet of having women or girl babies is improved.
I just wonder, though, whether this is the kind of thing that people, when they're thinking about having babies, are considering, like the cultural value of there being too many single men in the world or something like that. Like, I mean, without telling tales out of school, you've got little kids, and that's not the kind of thing that you'd be thinking about, would you? Is this good for the country, whether I have a boy or a girl?
No, I wouldn't. But not good for the country. Good for your family in a personal sense, because if you have a son who's never able to marry, then you're not like getting that intergenerational support coming through, and also just at an emotional level, you're not getting grandkids. So I don't think they're thinking about it as a like societal demographic challenge, but I think that that societal demographic challenge that people talk about is reflected also in individual families' lives. And so, yeah, but I don't think it's necessarily, I think it's still a good thing if girls are being more valued or less undervalued, that people aren't aborting them just because they're girls. Like, even if that's because, the demographic balance got too out of whack, or people have realized, no, actually we do need women in the world also. Like, that's still better than the previous status quo.
ICE correspondence from Jeff. Chaz, on the Noam press conference, this was involving Alex Padilla getting, he was kind of, inverse commas, asking a question, Reid yelling over Kristi Noam during a press conference, and then getting bustled out and handcuffed by the feds of some variety. On the Noam press conference, it was Corey Lewandowski who ran out from being a prop near Noam and told the agents that they had a senator in cuffs on ground and to let him up. Now, the reason why Jeff told me that, I mean, I knew that, but I hadn't really thought of the ramifications of that. I mean, that in itself is interesting, actually. I didn't tell you because I didn't think you guys knew who Corey Lewandowski was, but Corey Lewandowski he's a bit of a satellite player in the Trump administration, both 1 and 2. An incredibly aggressive fellow. Like he was an archetypal Trump dickhead in term 1. He was known for assaulting people, like literally assaulting people. He was a thug. And now he's known for rumors of having an affair with Kristi Noam. But let's leave that aside. He's now the voice of reason and accountability, apparently, in the Trump administration. And it says a lot that the guy who was known for being a hothead who assaulted people in the first term is now known as the voice of reason and responsibility. But the reason why Jeff brought that up is that's important evidence that the security guys had no idea who Padilla was. That it took Lewandowski to come in and say, hey, he's a senator, let him go, for them to go, oh, shit, he's a senator, and then they let him go. So that is a good point. I didn't think of that. That is evidence, strong evidence, that security had no idea that they were handcuffing the senator at that point in time. I still maintain, though, that doesn't change anything I said. That they did not think he was a real threat. The way they behaved was not the way security behaves when they think someone is an actual threat. At worst, they thought he was just a random, crazy, harmless guy just yelling out during a press conference. And there was no reason for them to cuff him once they had removed him from the room. Once they'd removed him from the room, he was out in the hallway. There was no need for them to go through the motions of arresting him and all this kind of stuff. They could have said, "What's the story, buddy?" Like happened to me 1,000 times with the chaser. 1,000 times I got ushered out, and then was told. I was ushered into a little room without windows, and they go, "Okay, buddy, what's going on?" That's what they do, but they didn't do that with Padilla. No, they got rough. They got rough, and they were handcuffing him, and they were going through motions of arresting him for still I don't know what. I don't know what law they could possibly have thought he was breaking by yelling during a press conference. But anyway, so I don't think it changed my main point, but it is a great point raised by Jeff that security almost certainly did not know who he was when they went through that motion. So for those going, "Oh, this is a sign of creeping authoritarianism, that if they can do this to a senator, what can they do to you?" They didn't know he's a senator. They thought he was you. So that is exactly what they would do to you. And I think that is too much. I think that's a problem. But let's just be clear what the problem is. I think they're too rough, full stop, and too prone to arrest, full stop. Melina, do you have any thoughts on that?
Just that I also thought, one of the points you made last week was that, they should have assumed if he had gotten into that venue in the first place, he was a safe person because there was lots of security. And that I did disagree with, because I feel like in this day and age in America, you just can't ever take for granted that someone who's made it into a secure space is meant to be there and doesn't have ill intent towards anyone. But your point about how they treated him after the fact absolutely remains. So I still think it's an issue. But yeah, I do kind of understand, until you ascertain that someone is not a threat, you certainly can't assume that in America these days.
Fair enough. And finally, trivia correspondence from CSN. I'm loving the Dave trivia questions. Can it become a regular occurrence with a sting? Now peppers are putting in requests for stings as well. Look, if someone still wants to make a sting, we'll use it. Someone has made is it fascist sting? Thank you very much for that. I think it was Dan.
Yeah, it was.
Thanks, Lockie. It was Dan. And when Dave's back, we will definitely use that, Dan. So thank you. And if you want to do a trivia time sting, I'm sure Dave will use it.
Can we have some kind of swearing censorship sting that's less objectionable than a classic beep to people?
What a brilliant idea. That's really good, Melina. If someone wants to come up with something that they think will not piss people off when we're censoring F words and C words, please send it through. Anything. Like I know Craig Ferguson used to have an "ay caramba," which was kind of annoying. But whatever you guys want. Whatever you guys want. Just,
and if nothing else, maybe just you doing the eagle noise.
Sure. Why not? Okay, and someone did get back to us on the gambling question. I asked about Australian gambling versus American gambling, but I haven't done the full conversions yet. I got a little bit sick. So I'll save that for the final PEP of this bracket on Thursday. Couple of quick updates, and then Melina, I'm going to get you talking on the run because I don't know what happened today. I just know a lot did. Tariffs. The Supreme Court has denied a request for an emergency ruling on Trump's tariffs. Last we heard, a number of courts had held that the Liberation Day tariffs and the Canadian and Mexican tariffs were illegal, and the court ordered they were reversed. Well, several courts ordered they be reversed. The appeals court placed a hold on those orders, so the tariffs are still in place for now. The Supreme Court just this week denied a request for an emergency ruling. What that means is they could change their mind in the future. They could have an emergency ruling in a week or in a month or in 6 months. But if they don't change their mind, and they usually don't, then there won't be a ruling on this for at least 6 months, possibly 12 months, which means Trump is going to face no legal impediments for his tariffs for a long time. So there you go. So all those court cases mean nothing for at least the next 6 months, possibly 12 months. That didn't get much news. So I just thought You probably don't know that, so I just want to raise that for you. Also, Treasury Secretary Scott Bessent says they're willing to push back the July 8 deadline. This is the most predictable thing in the world. Push back the July 8 deadline for the Liberation Day trade deals. Remember those 90 trade deals in 90 days? Bessent says as long as good faith negotiations are occurring, they will continue. They will push the deadline back to allow those deals to occur. Least surprising news ever. That's it on tariffs. I assume you don't want to add anything, Melina? Just no. Okay. Another quick one on Musk. He's still fuming. Remember his little tiff with Trump? He's still fuming even now about his buddy Jared Isaacman not getting appointed to be NASA director. That was one of the things I thought might be the cause of his blow up a few weeks back. It is starting to appear like that was a significant part of why he flipped out. He replied to just a random article on Twitter about Sergio Gore, the personnel director for Trump, and he's the one that Musk blames for Isaacman getting shafted, by the way. He just responded to a random article with, "He's a snake." So it appears that Musk is still simmering away on this question. So just flag that. And one more quick update, TikTok. I'm planning to mention this on Wednesday's show anyway. Should I make it there? I think I'm going to make it there. But I wanted to mention it everywhere because I'm really angry about this. I can't believe this. In 2024, Congress passed the Protecting Americans from Foreign Adversary Controlled Applications Act. That's the TikTok law. And that law forced ByteDance to either sell TikTok or it would ban TikTok from America. It was very clear. They did offer the possibility for a 90-day extension in certain circumstances. 1, 90-day extension if the following conditions were met. The president must certify A qualified sale to a buyer uncontrolled by China has been identified. B, the deal is imminent. C, binding legal agreements are in place to enable that sale. Those are the sole conditions for a 90-day extension. You need all three of them. Trump gets in, immediately grants an extension. None of those conditions have been met. He doesn't care. He just grants an extension with an executive order anyway. So that's pretty bad. But, you go, okay, this is the kind of thing where we need to go to court. They're going to suss it out. They're going to tweeze apart the definition of this word and that word. You can see how this works with legal fig leaves here. Sure. But when the extension was up, he just granted another extension. Now he's just granted a third extension. The law says you can only have one extension. There's no doubt about this. It's very clear. You can't do that. Of all the lawlessness in this administration, this might be the least consequential because I don't think many people care. But this could be the most blatant example of lawlessness in the Trump administration, where they are actively, overtly define a law in a way that no one could possibly rationalize or justify. It is impossible to come up with even the tiniest justification for this. It's so blatantly against not a law from 1932, a law from a couple of months ago. It's just so, the congressman who passed that is still there. You can't do that. Okay, now you might wonder, how do they get away with this then? Why doesn't someone sue them? Well, no one can sue them because the law also says it can only be enforced by the Justice Department through civil action. And guess what? Pam Bondi is not going to be contradicting Trump anytime soon. So while Trump chooses to not enforce the statute, it's not going to be enforced. Trump can do whatever the hell he likes. Now, to be clear, Trump is not the first president to employ discretion of enforcement. Every president does it. Obama, for instance, famously didn't enforce immigration laws against kids who came to America as toddlers illegally. They're the darker kids. Remember them? They're still there. Trump still hasn't gotten rid of them. But that was an example of where there were very limited resources to enforce laws against a very large number of people. And so Obama was in a position where he had to practice discretion. Who are you enforcing laws against? You can't enforce them against everyone. And so in that case, Obama was saying, well, I'm practicing my discretion to focus on criminals rather than to focus on kids who are who are now at college and have jobs and are effectively American. So that was, in the context of what American presidents have done in the past, pretty standard stuff. But in this case, there's no resource issue here. Trump has just decided he doesn't like the law, and so he's going to pretend the law doesn't exist. Full stop. Not part of a law, not for these people versus those, but just full stop. The law just does not exist as far as Trump is concerned. And that is infuriating to me. And where is this heading? I say this kind of thing a lot, but this is heading nowhere good. When presidents just start unilaterally deciding what they think the law should be and proceed accordingly, that is one more step towards dictatorship. And that's not me saying Trump is going to be Hitler, because the next president is going to push it just that bit further. That's what they do. They always just push it just that little bit further. This ends nowhere good. And so that's why I think you should care. Even though you might not care about whether TikTok is around or not, you should care about creeping lawlessness. Any thoughts, Melina, before you go to Iran?
Yeah, I just think most ordinary people, as you're kind of hinting at, don't care about laws in the abstract, except for lawyers. And there are a lot of lawyers and former lawyers in the media, but day-to-day people, it's not, they don't necessarily feel passionate about the importance of laws themselves. They'll point to the illegality of something like a war or deportations if they don't like the thing that the law is being broken to achieve, rather than the principle itself. And so I think, as you kind of said, for something like TikTok, allowing it, a lot of people in America like TikTok, use TikTok. For other people, it probably just feels like a bit of a victimless crime to let it continue. And, with all the kind of outrages that are happening in America at the moment, I can see why it doesn't feel like a big priority to people to get worked up about whether Trump is letting TikTok continue with business as usual or not. But, I agree with the broader point that, the principle of upholding the law is important, because it's also important to prevent all the other abuses that people are more concerned about at the moment. And so, yeah, as soon as you kind of just set precedents that presidents can just choose which laws they want to follow and which ones they don't want to follow, based on their own whim, it's a dangerous precedent.
Let's get to Iran. I've got a couple of correspondences here before I let you go, Melina. First from Ash. These are just critiques, which I thought I should share. Dr. Dave's Middle East hot takes are markedly less informed than his American ones. Notably, what's Israel actually got to worry about from an Iranian nuclear weapon if they've got a far more advanced nuclear weapons program to defend themselves? That's a quote. I think it's a quote. He's put in quote marks. Dave definitely did say something to that effect. That's not how nuclear weapon warfare works. It's not my big truck smashes your smaller truck. Also, potentially opening up the biggest conflict is another quote. Potentially opening up the biggest conflict in the region since the Iraq War in order to stop the remote possibility that one day a nuclear weapon might be developed. If Dr. Dave thinks the possibility that Iran might one day get a nuclear weapon if no action was taken against them is remote, I would suggest that he's probably not informing himself from the best sources. Literally no serious person thought the possibility of Iran one day obtaining a nuclear weapon was remote. Look, I'll speak for Dr. Dave here. Look, we talk off the top of our heads on this podcast, and sometimes we use words we don't mean. I don't think if he sat down in the cold light of day, he would say there's only the tiniest chance that Iran, left to their own devices, would one day have a nuclear weapon. What he was referring to was the chance of them having a nuclear weapon tomorrow in an imminent fashion, which we are going to get to, the sense of imminence. And he was of the judgment that they were unlikely to imminently have a nuclear weapon. You can be of a different view, but I don't think he meant ever one day, sometime in the future. Obviously, if no one was paying any attention to Iran, and just left them alone for 10 years, then yeah, they might have a nuclear weapon. But that's not what he meant. So but at the same time, the reason I read that out was not because I want to split hairs about wording. It's because I do think that we probably didn't emphasize enough. I think your broader critique, if we rather than worrying about the particular wording, I think your broader critique that we were a bit cavalier about Iran having nuclear weapons, I think that's probably true. I think we're probably on the cavalier side. I'm not taking back anything we said in terms of my particular view about the situation. We'll talk more about this, I'm sure, in the next hour or so with me and Melina, but I do think that we were quite dismissive talking about the Iran, going, oh, well, there's no evidence, so let's just move on. It's a serious question with a serious judgment call to make, because if you get wrong, there are serious consequences. And I think that we shouldn't act like it's something to be blasé about. It's not something to be blasé about. It's a tough question, whether balancing, and this is something we will get back to again, but balancing the odds of and the danger of Iran having a nuclear weapon in the very near future versus the odds of starting the next Iraq war, except for much worse, in the very near future. Those were the two risks that had to be balanced out. And different people will come to different conclusions about what is the greatest risk and what is the greatest danger if it actually occurs. If they're both the same chance of happening, is it worse for Iran to have a nuclear weapon than to start the next Iraq war for the next 10 years in Iran? Maybe you might think that the Iran war is worse than Iran having a nuclear weapon, in which case you take your chances. Like, that is a question that you have to judge for yourself. I know we are going to talk about this, so you might want to save your powder for that, Melina, but do you want to jump in at this point in
time? No, let's get into the kind of updates.
Okay, all right. And Felix says, I think you totally missed the mark on the effectiveness of strikes on Iran and impact on nuclear development. The logic that strikes will encourage Iran to double down and develop weapons even faster, it's logical, but it's not backed by the evidence we have. One, not only will strikes deprive Iran of potentially decades of development facilities, but supposedly 9 of Iran's top 10 nuclear scientists were killed on the first day. We know that. We mentioned that. So there is a real question mark on whether they have the knowledge to rebuild in 10 years, let alone 1 or 2. Nukes are really, really complicated and more than just running some centrifuges. If you lose your entire tech stack overnight, could take decades to rebuild. All the attention's on enrichment, but countries often spend decades researching and building surrounding infrastructure to even begin enrichment, and then developing precision metallurgy, high explosive lens design, hydrodynamic testing, electronics, etc. That could be 20 years of R&D, I would argue. The second time you do it's a lot faster, even if most of your nuclear scientists have been killed. And 3, most importantly, look at history. Every time military action has been used to halt a nuclear program, it's been successful. None of the countries that have had their nuclear programs bombed, Iraq and Syria, went on to develop nuclear weapons. Where diplomacy has been used, it's been effective once in Libya and not effective once in North Korea and unclear once in Iran. So the hit rate seems better for bombing than diplomacy if you really have to pick one, which I thought the third point was a point worth making. So that's why I read it out. We will get to that as well, whether the nuclear deterrent is gone now or not. And then finally from Z, correction. This is my favorite one. This is an important correction. US is the great Satan. Israel is little Satan. Britain is the sly fox. Saudi Arabia is the wolf. And Egypt is the great pharaoh. What we're referring to there is Iran's nicknames for countries. Dave said that Britain was a little Satan. So and Zay's correcting. No, you're wrong. So I'll read that again because these are important, these categories. America is the great Satan. Israel is the little Satan. Britain is a sly fox. Saudi Arabia is the wolf. And Egypt is the great pharaoh. So let's just get that straight. Melina, tell us what happened today.
All right. So I'm just going to rattle through some of the events of the past 24 hours.
Please.
Probably most people listening to this will already know all of this. So it's less about informing you guys and more about letting you guys know how informed we are as we embark on this discussion, because I'm sure that this will be out of date from a news perspective by the time anybody's listening to this.
It's definitely going to inform me, at the very least. Have an audience of one. Yeah.
So just so that you all know what information we're working with for the purposes of this discussion. Iran's retaliation came, first of all, against the US strikes. They conducted a strike against an American airbase in Qatar, and they gave warning in advance so that there were no casualties in that bombing. So that is effectively a de-escalation. It's a face-saving, symbolic strike, but clearly an effort was made to not escalate militarily with the United States. As Trump described the strike, they've gotten it all out of their system. And there will hopefully be no further hate. I want to thank Iran for giving us early notice, which made it possible for no lives to be lost and nobody to be injured. Perhaps Iran can now proceed to peace and harmony in the region, and I will enthusiastically encourage Israel to do the same. Thank you for your attention to this matter.
Drink.
This is similar to the approach that Iran took in 2020 after the US in the previous Trump administration killed Iran's top general, and Iran responded by firing missiles at an American base in Iraq, but also in that instance with advance warning. So they're going out of their way to not kill Americans, knowing that should they kill American troops in a retaliation, it's going to escalate things way worse. So clearly they're trying to avoid an all-out war with America in particular. Iran did continue to strike Israel, civilian areas in this time, and Israel continued to strike Iran with other military targets. Trump today announced a ceasefire between Iran and Israel. It'll take a day to take effect while current operations finish. So they're like, get your last bombings in before we take a break. And according to Trump, it's an open-ended ceasefire, or as he describes it, it's going to go forever. Israel hasn't confirmed the ceasefire agreement at the time that we're recording this. Yeah. And Iran's foreign minister has said in a post on social media that there was no ceasefire agreement, but that if Israel stopped its attacks on Iran, Iran would also stop firing, which I think also just feels like a little bit of a face-saving thing. There's been reports that Qatar was involved in the negotiations. Vance and Hegseth have been involved in the negotiations. You know, clearly a deal or an agreement has been struck, even if it's not formalized in writing. But that is basically where we're up to at the time of recording right now.
Okay. All right. Yeah, it's hard to know how to react to that because on one hand, that it's classic kind of Iran like to talk tough, and it's a classic talk tough kind of move to go, well, if you want to stop firing, then we will. You first. Like a classic face-saving move, as you say. But on the other hand, Trump has, on numerous occasions, declared agreements that were just fictional in his own head. So it's tough for me to assume that ceasefire is actually going to happen. But having said that, I think for the purposes of this discussion, we should probably just assume it is going to happen, at least for a day. While we talk about this going forward. Okay, well, why don't we start then, given that that's the latest news, I think we should still start in the same place, which is the American strike. Why he went through the strike, the logic, was it sound? Basically, let's Monday quarterback the airstrike for America, essentially. For a start, we should know that Trump, this is a decision he had to make, but he did have a lot of advice. He did have the finest of advice, actually. I'm going to quote Matt Gertz. This is a Matt Gertz tweet. Matt Gertz was from Media Matters, and I thought this was a beauty. A Fox host told Trump over lunch 2 weeks ago that Iran was days from a nuke, which he apparently believed over the denials of the former Fox contributor he made Director of National Intelligence. Then Trump woke up on Friday and saw wall-to-wall positive coverage of Israeli strikes on Iran and decided he wants some credit. Now the former Fox host, Trump, named Secretary of Defense, has the US military marshalling forces in the region, while a different former Fox host has been in a scorched earth fight with the first Fox host to capture Trump's attention and stop it. No matter what happens, this much is certain. A bunch of current and former Fox News employees are essentially deciding whether the America is going to war. I think that is spot on. It's a great call. And those Fox hosts really do add up after a while, don't they? He does have them all over the place. But also, I want to give a hat tip to Carrick Ryan here, who's an Aussie writer, I didn't see anyone else notice this, but he noticed this. And look, maybe it's irrelevant. Maybe this is just joining dots that they have no line between them. But back in September 2024, Jared Kushner wrote an essay, which I'm going to quote, courtesy of Carrick Ryan. I've spent countless hours studying Hezbollah, and there is not an expert on earth who thought that what Israel has done to decapitate and degrade them was possible. This is just after they took out Hezbollah. This is significant because Iran is now fully exposed. The reason why their nuclear facilities have not been destroyed, despite weak air defense systems, is because Hezbollah has been a loaded gun pointed at Israel. Iran spent the last 40 years building this capability as its deterrent. President Trump would often say, Iran has never won a war but never lost a negotiation. The Islamic Republic's regime is much tougher when risking Hamas, Hezbollah, Syrian and Houthi lives than when risking their own. Their foolish efforts to assassinate President Trump and hack his campaign reek of desperation and are hardening a large coalition against them. Israel now finds itself with the threat from Gaza mostly neutralised and the opportunity to neutralise Hezbollah in the north. It's unfortunate how we got here, but maybe there can be a silver lining in the end. This is a moment to stand behind the peace-seeking nation of Israel and the large portion of the Lebanese who have been plagued by Hezbollah and who want to return to the times when their country was thriving and Beirut was a cosmopolitan city. The main issue between Lebanon and Israel is Iran. Otherwise, there's a lot of benefit for the people of both countries from working together. The right move now for America would be to tell Israel to finish the job. It's long overdue, and it's not only Israel's fight. Now, Jared Kushner is not the only person who's been saying that for the last 6 months. John Bolton's been saying that since about 979. There's lots of neocons who have been saying that for ages. And Kushner is theoretically not one of Trump's advisors anymore. But I can't help wondering, this is what Carrick Ryan said, and I agree with him. I can't help wondering how many times that Jared Kushner might have had this conversation with Donald Trump in the past. Just mano a mano. And whether it's just there lodged in his head, just thinking, yeah, if the opportunity comes, yeah, maybe. And like, it's just possible that he might be more influential than we think. It's just possible. We don't know. It's complete speculation, but I know what Jared Kushner would have been voting in terms of the option. In terms of Trump's advisors, he had apparently he's completely ignoring Tulsi Gabbard. She wasn't even in the room. He had Dan Kane, who was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Michael Kurilla, who was the commander of the United States Central Command, and John Ratcliffe was the CIA head. I don't know what good Dan Kane would have to say. I imagine if he was just there to talk about what the army could do, he wouldn't have been too worried about the difficulty of bombing. But, maybe he would have. I don't know. Michael Kurilla has been known as a hawk for a long time, so I think we're pretty sure what he would say. John Ratcliffe is widely known to be concerned about Iran's nuclear program. He apparently said to lawmakers just recently, he drew a football analogy to describe Iran's ambitions. He said, if a team has gone 99 yards down the field, its intention was obviously to score a touchdown, not stop at the 1 yard line. Now, that is his point of view. We discussed last week that there are other options. There is a certain status and power to being on the 99 yard line and just staying there. A status and power that you don't have if you're on the 0 yard line. That's the first thing. Especially given the Ayatollah is an authoritarian who is oppressing his people. He needs to look strong. He needs to look powerful. He needs to look like he knows what he's doing. He needs to not look like he's wasted the last 30 years on a program that went nowhere. So that's part of him staying in power. Also, I was of the view that given that the people who are in charge at the moment are the negotiators, the guys who negotiated the last Iran deal, the people who in Iran they call moderates. Outside Iran, no one would ever call them moderates. But inside Iran, they call them moderates. Since those guys are the ones in charge at the moment, it would make sense that they would want to have as much as possible to negotiate with. So enriching as much uranium as possible so they can give it up. And I emphasize at no point in time in negotiations has there been any question that they're going to give up all their uranium. The question is about enriching further uranium. How much can they do? Where can they do it? On what conditions can they do it? That was always the issue. So them stockpiling huge amounts of uranium, enriched uranium, does have a purpose other than a nuclear bomb, and that is to create leverage for better negotiations.
Yeah, because the problem with the football analogy is that the game of football has one goal, which is to win the game. You win or you lose the game, and you win by scoring more points than your opponent. So, yes. Obviously, if you're close to a touchdown, your your only goal is to make the touchdown, or you could kick the ball. But in the case of Iran, like there's more than one possible outcome for them to consider. And so therefore there is like, beyond the question of what their intentions were and what the possibilities were, there are things that you could at least try to induce them to do that could also be a potential win for them.
Absolutely. And so the question we then have, which Trump was confronting, which we will now confront, is what does the intelligence say? Everyone agreed that Iran had enriched a lot of uranium, way more than they needed for any non-weapon usages. Everyone agrees with that. The question was, are they doing that to actually have a nuclear weapon? The New York Times reported on Thursday, bear in mind the attack was on Saturday, the New York Times reported on Thursday that US intelligence agencies continue to believe that Iran is yet to decide whether to make a nuclear bomb. And also that the intelligence community, quote, assessment has not changed since the intelligence agencies last addressed the question of Iran's intentions in March, when Tulsi Gabbard famously said that they were not trying to get a bomb. On the contrary, the intelligence community believed Iranian leaders were likely to shift towards producing a bomb if the American military attacked the uranium enrichment site Fordo, which they ended up doing. On Friday, IAEA Director General Rafael Grossi said, "We do not have at this point, if you ask me at this time, any tangible proof that there is a program or a plan to fabricate, to manufacture a nuclear weapon." And recall, the last time America ignored the IAEA's advice about nuclear matters, the IAEA were right in Iraq. And Democrat Senator Chris Murphy, since the bombing, has made very clear on numerous occasions, quote, "I was briefed on the intelligence last week. Iran posed no imminent threat of attack to the United States. Iran was not close to building a deliverable nuclear weapon. The negotiations Israel scuttled with their strikes held the potential for success." And that has been the concern all along, that Israel attacked when they did, not because they thought they didn't have a day to lose before a nuclear weapon. Oh, it could be coming next week. Not because of that, but because they were trying to scuttle the negotiations between Iran and America, which they successfully did. And they thought here was a perfect opportunity to denuclearize Iran for good, and let's not lose this opportunity. So they were taking advantage of an opportunity rather than actually trying to head off an imminent threat. That has been the concern. Whether that's true or not, we don't know. Israel have all their intelligence as well, which the US have seen and were unimpressed by, apparently. But that is the concern. On the other hand, Marco Rubio says whether they were actually trying to make a bomb or not was irrelevant.
Are you saying there that the United States did not see intelligence that the Supreme Leader had ordered weaponization?
That's irrelevant. I think that question being asked in the media, that's an irrelevant question.
No,
they have
that is
everything
the
they need
key
to build
point
a
in U.S. intelligence assessments. You know that.
No, it's not.
Yes, it was.
No, it's
that
not.
The political decision had not been made.
I know that better than you know that, and I know that that's not the case.
But I'm asking you whether the order was given.
And the people who say that, it doesn't matter if the order was given. They have everything they need to build nuclear weapons. Why would you bury things in a mountain, 300 feet under the ground?
Right.
Why would you bury why do they have 60% enriched uranium? You don't need 60% enriched uranium. The only countries in the world that have uranium at 60% are countries that have nuclear weapons. Because they can quickly make it 90. They have all the elements. They have. Why do they have a space program? Is Iran going to go to the moon? No, they're trying to build an ICBM.
No, but
so
that's a question. That's a question of intent. And you know, in the intelligence assessment, that it was that Iran wanted to be a threshold state and use this leverage. I'm talking about the public March assessment, and that's why I was asking you if you know something more from March.
But that's also an inaccurate representation of it. That's an accurate representation of it. That's not how intelligence is read. That's not how intelligence is used. Here's what the whole world knows. Forget about intelligence. What the IAEA knows. They are enriching uranium well beyond anything you need for a civil nuclear program. So why would you enrich uranium at 60%? Right. If you don't intend to one day use it to take it to 90 and build a weapon. Right. Why are you developing ICBMs? Why do you have 8,000 short-range missiles and 2,000 to 3,000 long mid-range missiles that you continue to develop? Why do you do all these things? They have everything they need for a nuclear weapon. They have the delivery mechanisms, they have the enrichment capability, they have the highly enriched uranium that is stored. Yes. That's all we need to see.
Right. Well,
especially in the hands of a regime that's already involved in terrorism and proxies and all kinds of things around. They are the source of all
yes, and no one's disputing that. I'm not doing that here. And they were censured at the IAEA for that enrichment and for violating their non-proliferation agreements. I was simply asking if we had intelligence that there was an order to weaponize, because you said weaponization ambitions.
Well, we have intelligence that they have everything they need to build a nuclear weapon, and that's more than enough.
Seems to me he's just avoiding the question entirely, as if it doesn't matter.
Can I also take the... Sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, go on.
Can I take the opportunity of a Rubio clip to correct myself, because I misspoke earlier. I realized when I believe I said that Vance and Hegseth were negotiating the ceasefire agreement with Iran and Israel, and I should have said Vance and Rubio, because Hegseth has reportedly been totally sidelined from every aspect of this, which is probably well advised. Anyway, continue.
It definitely is. He also said, why would you enrich uranium if you didn't intend one day to make it a nuclear weapon? That goes to what I said before. One day is not the issue, folks. Now is the issue for a preemptive strike, and you need it to be a preemptive strike to justify it. So are they trying to do it now or not? One day doesn't cut it. Are they trying to do it now? The difference matters. It matters a lot. But Rubio's saying it doesn't matter at all. It's irrelevant. And he's basically just restating the 1 yard line argument over and over and over again. Why have they gone this far if they don't want to go further? Well, I think there are other reasons. Hegseth, for what it's worth, the sidelined Hegseth, or as the bloggers that I read sometimes call him Kegseth. Hegseth is he wasn't terribly reassuring either.
In March, the Office of the Director of National Intelligence released their threat assessment, concluding, quote, Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and Khomeini has not authorized the nuclear programs he suspended in 2003, unquote. So what new intelligence does the U.S. have since then that the Iranians have changed their position on nuclear weapons? And does this new intelligence come from U.S. sources and methods, or are we getting this information from other countries?
Well, I would just simply say that the president's made it very clear. He's looked at all of this, all of the intelligence, all of the information, and come to the conclusion that the Iranian nuclear program is a threat, and was willing to take this precision operation to neutralize that threat in order to advance American national interests, reduce the Iranian nuclear program, and obviously collective self-defense of ourselves and our allies. So he looked at all of it, understood the nature of the threat, and took bold action I think the American people would expect in a commander-in-chief.
So he just completely avoided the question as well, except for he did it much less competently than Marco Rubio did, which is probably why he's been sidelined. To me, I'm going to get your take on this in a sec, Melina, but to me that suggests that Chris Murphy's telling the truth. The fact that these guys are refusing to interact with the question at all about what the intelligence community actually believe about Iran's rush to a nuclear bomb, the fact they won't even interact with it suggests to me they know the answer doesn't suit them. I think Chris Murphy's telling the truth, that the American intelligence community was very clearly saying Iran is not trying to get a bomb. So then it goes back to what I was saying before. It depends on your gut instinct of the relative risks of letting Iran go forward, even though the intelligence community says they're not going forward, versus potentially getting stuck in another Middle East war. What are your thoughts on this?
First of all, I'm not sure if it's right to say that the US military concluded that they weren't going forward, in the sense that there was, some suggestions that they were, increasing their levels of enrichment and, like doing more research for weaponization.
Yes.
But that's different from whether there is a threat that is imminent or whether they've made the decision to go for it, to like, we are building a nuclear bomb right now. Like, those are different things. And so... Yeah,
it's a good clarification.
You can still sort of say there's progress happening, and that's still concerning. But the threshold question, I think for a war is whether they've made it, whether they're kind of getting close to passing a point of no return. And we just don't know. Obviously, even with the best intentioned administrations, we're going to not know more than we know when it comes to intelligence, right? Like, we're seeing the stuff that, is put out in public is like barely the tip of an iceberg relative to all the information that is kept classified and hidden behind the scenes. But, I think that in the last PEP, you're talking about how it all has a touch of the Iraqs for you. And the thing which, really like does feel that way to me, a parallel, is just this real kind of public posturing of just trust us, that, we're making the right decision. And I certainly don't trust this administration or Netanyahu's administration just on its merits. I'm not saying that definitely means that they don't have good intelligence, but as you say, the obfuscation when people are asking about this, and they're legitimate questions for people to say, if you're going to bomb another country, we'd like to know why. You should be able to mount a defense of that. And instead, it kind of feels more like they're attacking journalists for asking questions. And I think that's a bad thing, because we saw the lack of critical thinking in the lead up to Iraq, and that's part of what led to it being a disaster. And so I don't think that the administration, if they are operating on good intelligence and in good faith, should be acting adversarially with the media, who are asking, that Face the Nation interview with Rubio was like, not a hit piece, not being unreasonable. She was asking pretty straightforward, reasonable questions. And he was engaging as a classic politician speak, trying to avoid giving a straightforward answer. And that does concern me.
Do you have a view that you'd like to express about your particular position on whether an airstrike should have happened? I mean, like I was very clear last week that, in my view, there was no need for a war at this exact moment, based on what we had heard from the intelligence, with the proviso that you said that they know much more than we do. But from what we had heard, I would say that Israel went too quickly, and America shouldn't have been pressured by Israel's timeline. And she said, hey, if you guys want to fight your own bloody war, go for it. But we're still negotiating, and we will continue to negotiate until we're satisfied. I would have kept on negotiating. I don't think it was right to strike at this point in time. I don't think all other options had been exhausted and there was no imminent threat, is my personal view in terms of balancing the risks. Because I personally was very worried about the risk of the next Iraq. What's your view?
Well, I had some sort of thoughts in the lead up to today, and then different reflections on the sort of question, slightly different question of whether it was the right decision or not based on what we've seen so far. In terms of the sort of question of the threat assessment, the suggestion that, as you say, Israel and the US are different countries with different interests. They are allies. Their interests often overlap in many ways, but they're not the same. And the question of whether, was there an imminent threat, or did Netanyahu and Israeli intelligence and military see an opportunity to strike and get rid of this nuclear program at a time when Iran is very weak and their allies in the region have been decimated, and Trump is kind of toying with potentially bringing back something that may or may not resemble Obama's Iran deal, which Israel hated, and that's just an unpredictable element. That calculation of, is this, not necessarily is the threat imminent, but is this just a great time, a great opportunity to deal with this problem? Even let's say, for instance, that is the reality of what happened. There's still a world in which you can understand the logic of them doing that, Israel. That this is a existential threat that's hung over them for a very long time, and it's probably the right conclusion militarily. Before, we will talk a lot more later about all the possible things that can happen after the fact. But in terms of just this specific threat of Iran having a nuclear bomb, this probably was the best opportunity for them to just take that off the table. And it looks like they may well have been successful. And Netanyahu calculated very successfully about his ability to draw Trump into this conflict to assist them, despite Trump, by all accounts, not wanting initially to be involved. I do think, I know you've talked a lot on PEP about, whether Trump is anti-war or pro-war. And I generally think that Trump will always prefer, I think he genuinely prefers deals to war. But the problem with Trump is that he's too ignorant and lazy to achieve deals in most instances, because he doesn't take the time, And I'm not just talking about this conflict, it's the same with Ukraine and Russia. He doesn't take the time to understand what the two sides of a conflict want, their history, their, the disputes that they're working out, the non-negotiables, all these kinds of things. The Obama-Iran deal took 2 years to negotiate. Trump does not have the patience to do deals like that. And he also doesn't want to make concessions. His version of, well, let's not go to war. Let's just have a deal is you give me everything you want. And if not, then it falls apart. And that's just not realistically how countries operate. And that's why we kind of find ourselves reverting back to war as the kind of seemingly easy out. So, I mean, those were sort of my thoughts in the lead up to the conflict and the threat assessment. But then the question of, was it a right decision? I had a lot of concerns about, I feel like you discussed most of the parallels already that I see between Iran and Iraq in the lead up. The other one, even from an Israeli perspective, is that you see with Iraq, the kind of lead up to that was that, you had this devastating terror attack in 9/11. America goes to war against Afghanistan in response. And then my impression at the time, and I was a teenager at the time, and I was not, across all the vast details of American politics, but my perception as I was starting to follow the news more was like, why are they suddenly talking about Iraq? What are we doing here? What does this have to do with 9/11? And it's kind of, and it sort of became apparent very quickly they were taking their eyes off the ball in one conflict before they'd finished it and starting another one. And it's not a perfect parallel because Iran has always been the bigger threat to Israel. It's not like that kind of comes as much out of the blue. It is a direct threat to Israel in a way that Iraq was not to America. But, this kind of wandering eye when you have one successful conflict and you start thinking, gee, what else could we kind of get our way on now that we're kind of on a roll militarily, can create problems as well. But yeah, it all kind of leads me to that question of, was this military action the right decision or not? And I have a lot of thoughts on that. So I don't know if you want to jump in at this point before we get into it.
No, go for it. I think this is the time.
Okay. I mean, the broader...
just before you go on, just set the rules here. Let's not talk hindsight here, because I have very intentionally given my view, repeated my view from last week, knowing what's happened since, and that already there will be people looking what's happened since and going, well, you're an idiot. But I'm being intellectually honest and sticking and just being very clear about my view. So we'll talk about how what happened today changes that down the track. But for now, let's just draw a line before today, what your thoughts were before today, I think. And then we'll make any changes we need to after that.
I think in many ways my views haven't changed, because even though the potential that this is a limited and successful military action feels greater today than it did yesterday, with the kind of quick announcement of a ceasefire and Iran clearly signaling that they don't want to go into an all-out war right now. I mean, the biggest thing for me is I think we should be very humble about the fact that we have no idea what happens from here, and nobody does. And so that question of, was it the right decision for Israel and the US, and particularly the US, we won't know the answer for that for a long time. We don't, we're talking about hindsight. We don't have enough hindsight yet to actually know that. So I think it's not cheating to say that, and obviously if the war does ultimately succeed in destroying Iran's nuclear program without other long-term negative consequences in the country and the region, then I would say that that will feel like the right decision, because I think the world in general is a better place with fewer nuclear weapons in it and fewer nuclear armed countries. And Iran is not the most responsible actor in the region. And so, of all the countries that would concern me to have one, it's one of the higher ones on the list. I don't want Iran to have a nuclear weapon. I'll just say it straight out. So, if this action manages to be limited and manages to take out that program without other repercussions that we'll look back on regretfully, then we probably have to concede it was a good thing to do. But if there are repercussions, then you're in the point of balancing, was it worth it? And not knowing what those repercussions will end up being, we can't make that assessment now, except to say then you have to go back and look with hindsight very carefully about, whether whether it was urgent, whether it was so imminent that there was no other choice now. Because if it's successful, in one sense, whether you have to do it now or not becomes less relevant, because it's probably a good thing on balance anyway. But if it ends up creating these negative flow-on consequences, then that question of was it really necessary right now become very relevant. I mean, in terms of the kind of, all the unknown potential outcomes, of which there are many. I mean, first of all, we don't know if the ceasefire will hold. It might be over by the time people are listening to this. It might never really start, so that's a big factor.
It might be bullshit.
Yeah. The kind of more optimistic view that I was half expressing just then is really a reflection of the news we have right now, which is, maybe people don't want to fight. And maybe that will be very untrue by the point people are listening to this, or, in a few days or a few weeks. The regime might take the ceasefire and use it as a chance to rebuild their weapons program and get to a nuclear bomb. Maybe they'll make the conclusion, we need it as early as possible because we have now learnt from painful experience that if we don't have a nuclear bomb, Israel and the US can do whatever they want with us whenever they want. And so that's our only way to guarantee safety. I appreciate the comments from the Peppers who, were pushing back on that view and saying if you genuinely can destroy it, it takes a very long time to rebuild. That may well be true. The reality is we don't know how destroyed the program is yet. If they really do take out everything, then obviously is going to make it much harder to achieve that goal quickly. And also it will make it a lot easier for Israel and the US to detect that they're doing it and take preemptive action again, to detect that they are making moves, because they have to take a lot more steps to get to that point of having a bomb if they're really back at zero. I would suggest even in the worst case scenario for Iran, they're not at zero, because even if they killed all the nuclear scientists, that information is going to be written down somewhere. They will have had contingencies, understanding that this was always a thing that could happen. And, there is a suggestion, I do kind of, it's a question of whether all of the enriched uranium would be in these facilities that have been bombed or whether it's been hidden in underground tunnels.
Yeah. I don't want to foreshadow what's coming up, but we have a lot of reason to believe that they have moved the uranium out of those facilities.
Yeah, and part of the argument against reviving some version of the Obama deal and having international inspectors is that Israel and US hawks argued, well, Iran is not telling us where all of the uranium is, so we can't inspect it because it's hidden. And if you know where it is, it can be inspected. If you don't know where it is, then that's the argument for why you can't trust them. But then that also would suggest it's not so easy to bomb it if you don't know where it is. So there's a little bit of a logic gap there, I think.
Yes. Good call.
One of the other possible outcomes of this is that the regime might fall. It is an incredibly weak regime right now. Iran's leadership has invested hundreds of billions of dollars in this weapons program. And what do they have to show for it? Crippling sanctions that's isolated the country, stunted the economic growth of the country. And it's a country with a proud history that I think the people of Iran know they deserve better than that. They have a supreme leader who's 86 years old and hiding in a bunker, not even able to communicate with the rest of his regime except through handwritten notes. He's hiding in a bunker while Israel and the US seem to just be able to do whatever they want. They're just flying over Iran, dropping bombs where they feel like it. There's basically no pushback. I mean, in terms of the actual military actions, obviously they are bombing Israel, and that's I'm not minimizing the damage that's been inflicted there because it is significant. But in terms of actually being able to defend against the strikes, there's nothing. So it is a very weak regime. It falling is a kind of a possibility. I would say if it does change, we should absolutely not assume it will change for the better. It's not necessarily going to be in a popular uprising of the people and then Iran becomes, a democratic Western-facing country. There was this from the New Yorker, which stuck out to me, of from World War II to 2010, more than half of authoritarian regimes that fell were followed by other authoritarian regimes, including Iran in 1979. And only a quarter of them led to a democracy, and that number was lower if it was triggered by violence or foreign military invasion. So the most likely result if the regime fell is the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps taking over. They could be even more aggressive internally and internationally than the current regime. As you said, the moderates, so-called, relatively speaking, have been in charge compared to some of the people that could take over. There could be a civil war. That's what's happened, in a number of countries in that region in recent years. There are a lot of potential flow-on consequences. Does the US manage to wash its hands of Iran if things get messy? Is that more likely if the regime stays in place? Is it more likely if the regime falls? Really depends on what happens. What's left of Iran's nuclear program is a big unanswered question. We don't even know if Iran knows the answer to that right now. There's probably going to be a period of time of trying to figure that out. Obviously, the major sites have sustained enormous damage. We don't know exactly how much, but I think we can safely assume it's a lot. So that's going to have a huge impact. But we don't know whether they're it's sort of decimated beyond repair or if it's a setback and if they are still sort of on their way. And even in that question of regime change, even the question of whether what America's view on that is very ambiguous at the moment, because Vance has been out and about suggesting that this is not about regime change, but then Trump himself truthed out. It's not politically correct to use the term regime change, but if the current Iranian regime is unable to make Iran great again, why wouldn't there be regime change? MEGA. And it's going to be interesting, I think, to see how his rhetoric on that unfolds in the coming days and weeks as the ceasefire does or doesn't unfold with it. It's not so long ago that Trump was in the Middle East saying to people, in the end, the so-called nation builders wrecked far more nations than they built, and the interventionists were intervening in complex societies that they did not even understand. In recent years, far too many American presidents have been afflicted with the notion that it's our job to look into the souls of foreign leaders and use U.S. policy to dispense justice for their sins. And then here he is advocating for regime change in Iran and bombing Iran. And so, the kind of lack of a cohesive strategy or worldview in the approach to some of this is also a bit of a wild card that means, it's I would not dare to predict where it's going from here.
Well, especially given he was so inconsistent on strikes. 2 weeks beforehand, he wanted nothing to do with any kind of aggressive intervention in Iran. The war happened and he was like, no, nothing to do with us. Within a day, he's saying we are doing this. And then all of a sudden he's striking. So he's shown such inconsistency in the past. Where you just couldn't rely on any position at this point in time.
I do think today's sort of ceasefire announcement answers one big question for me, which is about the intentions of the regime in one respect, which is that the regime wants to survive, the people in charge now.
Yes.
That's clearly what they're prioritizing over other considerations. It's a pretty humiliating defeat to have this program that's cost hundreds of billions of dollars just destroyed, have the great decades-long enemies, the big and the little Satan, bombing the crap out of Iran, and there being effectively no major pushback, particularly against the US as a result. That's quite a humiliating back down. It weakens them significantly, but clearly a calculation's been made. It would be suicidal to retaliate against America and escalate further. And that's clearly they've prioritized the short-term survival, but the literal survival of Ali Khamenei to not get assassinated, and the kind of short-term survival of the regime, presumably in the hopes of reconsolidating power and figuring out next steps from a position of still being in charge.
I'll tell you two other things that the ceasefire represents, it tells us as well, I think. Whether it actually exists or not, even if it's been mooted, it tells us two things. You just said it suggests that the Iranian regime wants to survive. I agree. That also, to me, is powerful evidence if they were going to get a bomb. And I'm still not convinced that they were. But if they were trying to get a bomb, they weren't about to use it in a hurry. They were going to use it as defense, not as offense. because we all know that if the moment that bomb gets used, Iran disappears. That is 100% clear to everyone, and I'm sure it's clear to them as well, that if they hate Israel more than they love themselves, then get a bomb, blow up Israel. Israel's a one-bomb country, as Iran has said a few times. Just takes one bomb, that's the end of Israel, and then Iran is gone as well. But if they want to survive, they're not going to do that. If they do want to survive, which I think this ceasefire suggests, then that is powerful evidence that there wasn't a justification for a preemptive strike.
Yes,
in hindsight.
The one thing I'd add to that is there are a lot of countries around the world that have nuclear weapons that are, not in the club of nations in high regard in the international order. And they're not all out there nuking people for that exact same reason. But it's not just about, having a nuclear bomb is not just about, or not primarily about, being able to nuke other countries. It gives you a certain power to get away with other things. So, you look at Iran and Ukraine, for example, America has supported Ukraine for years, but, they're not going and bombing Russia. It does give you a certain power to push around your neighbors and to kind of wield influence, particularly in your region, but also in the world. It makes you untouchable to a certain degree for the same reason, the reverse of what you just said. So you could bomb Iran, but unless you wipe them off the face of the map, they're going to bomb you worse. So, I think it does, having this is why countries want nuclear weapons when they do. It does give you a degree of power that you can use, to ends that may not be to other people's liking. And that, I think, is what Israel would have been afraid of, probably more than we're going to get nuked.
That's a great call. Well, I'm glad you made that point. But the other thing, I think this potential ceasefire does suggest, if there's any truth at all to Israel agreeing to a ceasefire, that says that Israel's extremely confident they wiped out their nuclear program. Because there is no way that they would have stopped at this point in time, at this moment, in this situation, if they thought a few more bombs would make them safer. They mustn't even have doubt. If they had doubt, they'd keep on going just to make sure, I think. So the fact that they're stopping, potentially, suggests that Israel have reason to believe that they did at least largely wipe out the nuclear program. So, I'm going to say probably double digits from now on in this podcast, that we don't know exactly how effective that bombing campaign was. You've already said several times. Clearly, Israel is voting that it was damaging, super damaging, because they agreed to this ceasefire, and we need no other evidence to demonstrate that.
Oh yeah, and to be clear, just in case I was ambiguous about it, where the line is for me is not everything about their program is fine and up and running versus destroyed. It's just the level of destroyed, is it down to a 1 or a 0 out of 10? So clearly, the thing that Israel ultimately wanted was the US to drop those enormous bombs, and they got that, and that was clearly the thing that they felt they needed to do the amount of damage required for them to be comfortable that they dealt with the problem, and that's happened. And so it's not, it's just a question of how long it sets them back. But it is undeniable that the setback is enormous, if not completely wiping out the program altogether. Yeah.
Now, you've gone through some of most of the factors into making such a decision for airstrikes and the pros and cons. But I don't think you've told us yet what you would have done as President Melina. What would you have done? Do you have an answer? As President Melina, would you have taken the airstrikes or not? Because I just said President Shahs was not taking those airstrikes.
Honestly, I would never want to be president, partly for these reasons. What I would do is such a different question from what a president should do. And to partly explain where I'm coming from, that I had this realization the other day that I think I feel about military actions the way classic conservatives in America feel about welfare, which is like, I just don't like wars. And like, if you really push me at a certain point, I have to concede, yeah, I don't know what you do in this situation if not war. And I concede that sometimes war or entering a war will get people an outcome that they're looking for, but I still don't like it. and I think that's the way that conservatives feel about welfare. Like, if you push them, they'll probably concede, like, yeah, we don't want people to starve on the street. And, at a certain point, private sector isn't going to take care of everything and the government has to do something, but I still just don't like it. And that's kind of how I feel about war, which is why I should not be a president, because presidents do have to decide questions like that. And I would not be in a position to make a good decision, I don't think. I mean, I have to say, one of the things I've always liked the most about Trump is that he, at least in theory, is a little bit more reticent to start wars. Because I think I don't want to like defame people by suggesting there are people out there who love war, or love killing. But there are definitely people out there who, are kind of into it in a way. Like, they're very quick to be in favor of fighting and war and, very just kind of take as a given that that's always something that should be on the table. I really kind of got riled up when you played the clip in the last PEP of Lindsey Graham saying that he was prepared to deal with the consequence. Yeah, take the risk of war in Iran. And it's like, that's very, very easy to say when it's literally no risk to you at all. You are not taking the risk. You are letting other people take the risk on your behalf. So, I kind of think, from my perspective, all the kind of dovish arguments, like instinctively, my instincts are dovish instincts. But having said that, part of that also means that I am in agreement with people saying it would be bad for Iran to have a nuclear weapon. So I'm also of the perspective that, that's not something that should be treated lightly or should just be like, oh, well, it's not a big deal. It is a big deal. I don't want to see that either. And so I suppose not having access to all the intelligence, my position is, if there's any way to resolve this without a war, my preference is always not war.
Sure.
We reached the point where the only way to have Iran not get a nuclear weapon is a strike, and they've managed to figure out a way to do that without creating a bigger ongoing war. And I have to concede that could well have been a good decision. So, time will tell. But yeah, I find it a really difficult question to answer from a personal perspective, because it's just not how my brain works on these areas.
That's fair enough. By the way, in defense of the warmongers, I don't think any of them, even like your Boltons and so forth, I don't think any of them are like actively crave war. Like, more death. Like when you go to uni, you see all these activists who are drawing cartoons of people with like they all seem to be vampires with like blood coming from their mouths and stuff. Like, war, death. I don't think anyone's like that. But I think the people who we call warmongers, it's not that they love war; it's they can't tolerate risk. And if you have a very big army, and you are scared of any kind of risk, you hide behind that army. That's the best way to eliminate risk. If you have the best military in the world by an absolute mile and you can't bear the thought of the tiniest chance of something going wrong, then swat it with that giant military. That is the way they think, I think. Now, I think in reality, it doesn't work like that. But I think that's what's going on. I don't think it's a craving blood. I think it's can't tolerate risk. Ironically, people often get construed as strong and tough when they're militant and they're hawks, whereas they're weak if they're dovish. But I actually think it's the opposite. I think that it takes more guts if you've got a strong army, it takes more guts to not use the army and to just hold back and take the risk, rather than to not take the risk and just jump at shadows and go, the big guys with the guns will save me. That's my personal view.
Yeah, I think people perceive risks differently. Like, I mean, I don't think that, people are out there being like, I love killing people. But, I think that, a lot of people, a lot of the hawkish types would say that someone like Obama was the one who was too risk averse because he was too scared of another Iraq, and therefore he entered a weak deal with Iran because he didn't want to take the risk of escalation. So perceptions of risk kind of depend on what you see as risky and what you don't see as risky. I think maybe what I was getting at with the kind of like people who are very into war is like, I think a lot of people who, understand the military, understand the military hardware that the US and other countries have, and really kind of, which I don't, because I'm not, military kind of person. So it's not a thing that I study in detail. People who really like understand the capabilities, I think sometimes get like tricked into thinking, or just have a tendency to think that it will be easy to get what they want in a situation. My guns are bigger than your guns, and you're doing something I don't like. And so why wouldn't I use my big guns to get what I want? I think that's a lot of the mentality as well. But I think, we've just seen so many times that it's not just guns shooting at guns. There's people behind those guns. And as soon as you bring people into the equation, it's very hard for things to not get very messy very quickly.
Yeah. Bottom line, we don't know what Trump based his opinion on, his decision to strike on. But we do know when Carolyn Levitt said this on Wednesday,
I have a message directly from the president, and I quote, based on the fact that there's a substantial chance of negotiations that may or may not take place with Iran in the near future, I will make my decision whether or not to go within the next 2 weeks. That's a quote directly from the president for all of you today.
So when he said that, Trump apparently had already made up his mind to attack. The Wall Street Journal reported last week, for all those people going, oh, no one saw this coming. Well, the Wall Street Journal reported last week that Trump told senior aides on Tuesday he had approved of attack plans for Iran, but was holding off on giving the final order to see if Tehran would abandon its nuclear program. That is consistent with the news this week from The Atlantic that the president had privately communicated his decision to bomb Iran's nuclear sites after a meeting with national security advisors on Wednesday. But that statement we just played on Thursday, sorry, that was Thursday, I said, not Wednesday, suggesting a 2-week window and a substantial chance of negotiation was a feint meant to keep the Iranians off guard, they said. It's possible, and I think probable actually, that he was giving Iran one last chance to make a breakthrough with talks at that point in time, because Steve Witkoff, who is Trump's most trusted negotiator, was at that point in time still talking to the foreign minister of Iran. Seems like a mighty coincidence to me that the attack came one day after Iran finally publicly ruled out negotiations till after the war was over. It seems like a massive coincidence. And even in the context of negotiations, they merely said, quote, they could show flexibility in the nuclear issue, which is not a lot of detail to rely on there if you're America. The foreign minister said this on TV. Americans want to negotiate and have sent messages several times that we clearly said that as long as this aggression doesn't stop, there's no place for talk or dialogue. And then Khomeinis came in with his usual helpful tough talk. Americans should know that any military involvement by the US will undoubtedly result in irreparable damage to them. Yeah, sure, mate. I mean, I think that's what happened. Personally, I think he was giving them one more chance and they screwed it up. And, let's put the blame on them a bit as well. We're talking about America, this, Israel, that. Iran would have to be absolute morons to not know that they were in serious danger of being attacked at this point in time. What are they doing? like they were never going to get a better potential set of circumstances than by drilling Witkoff. Witkoff is a notoriously weak negotiator. They were never going to get a better situation than that. Like whatever they came up with Witkoff, they could spend a few weeks on him, but whatever they came up with Witkoff was going to be better than any other result, either with or without a war. And once the war's there, it's definitely going to be a better result. Like, just definitely. So why Khomeiни's doing the I'm a lion roaring bullshit. I don't know. I know that's to his people a bit, but it is people that dumb that they hear that and go, oh yeah, that's great. Yeah, watch out, America. I don't know. I feel like this was poor leadership from Iran, and they kind of got what they were asking for a bit. In that, they just was so foolish and stupid, and they should have agreed a long time ago, and they definitely should have shown more flexibility than they showed the day before the strikes, in my view. I don't know what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think, in a way, like going back to that question of, what do I do if I'm president? My instincts are I'm negotiating until I can't negotiate anymore. And then if you're left with no choice, then I'm bombing. But like you say, it's not smart to not be negotiating or not appear to be negotiating when you are in such a vulnerable position, because I don't really understand where that is supposed to lead that's going to be good for Iran and the regime specifically. All I can think is whether there was like a lack of effective communication between leaders in Iran, because a lot of senior leaders had been killed, and like at a certain point Khomeiни's in hiding, and whether that was a factor potentially, because it doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It does feel like, like clearly from the response that you've seen since the bombings happened, they were not in a position to fight back against an attack militarily. So, what was the end game for them with that approach? I'm not sure. It feels maybe just like a little bit desperate and uncoordinated.
Maybe that may well be what was going on, because you're right. It's not wise to take a risk if you're in the position of Iran leadership of getting on the wrong side of the Ayatollah. It doesn't necessarily pay. That is true. I understand why they could have been bluffing 6 months ago, 3 months ago even. But when Israel was making really clear that they were coming for you, you're not going to see out that bluff. You're just not going to. They will call you on it. They will call you on it every time. And at that point in time, there's just no point. Like, just get the best deal you can get and then move on. And that's my thought. But anyway. So given Trump had made up his mind, based on whatever, given he may have been allowing one last chance for Iran and Iran screwed it up, I guess the only question left then was how sure they were they could take out the nuclear program completely. And we now have more information than we did before the strikes on that. Not much more. There's still uncertainty, but I think everyone was sure if they left enough nuclear program behind, then Iran was going to go hard on nuclear building then. It's a question of how much they would leave behind. And also how likely this was to turn to regime change. All right, if we could just pause at that moment, we'll come back to that thread with the knowledge that we now have. But I just want to talk about the legality of all this as well, because that hasn't changed, especially given that Democrats are talking about like impeaching and all this kind of stuff. All right, so first of all, is this whole war legal full stop? Because Netanyahu said, I'm talking the Israel war, the Israel-Iran war. Netanyahu said that he had to take this action to preempt an Iranian attack being planned on Israel. Now, the UN Charter is pretty clear. It prevents the use of force except with the authorization of the UN Security Council or in the exercise of the right of self-defense. If an armed attack occurs, also if they do regard preemptive strikes as self-defense potentially. Like if it's preemptive, like an imminent threat, that means. Now, Israel have not sought to pretend that they are explicitly acting in self-defense. They have written a letter to the UN vaguely gesturing towards it, but they haven't specifically cited self-defense provisions, we should say. They claim to be acting to defend their security and very existence against Iran's ongoing aggression. These are quotes. Referring to an existential and imminent threat from Iran's nuclear weapon and ballistic missile program, as well as the imminent threat of Iranian missile and proxy attacks. They describe their military operation as a last resort, taken in the last window of opportunity to prevent Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons after diplomacy proved ineffective, which is an interesting take given diplomacy was still going. And I think that, saying that there's the last window of opportunity, I should also note, Israel's use of force is not directed against the proxy groups they just mentioned or against Iran's lines of support for the proxy groups. Like, a missile launched by the Houthi, say, from Yemen, can't justify bombing nuclear energy facilities in Iran. So it's weird that they're citing proxies as a justification as well. Israel did cite a statement from the Ayatollah that Israel is, quote, a cancerous tumor that must be eradicated, and it will be. But threats don't mean anything. If threats meant something, then Trump would be declaring war on everyone all the time. They also note Iran's direct attacks on Israel in April and October 2024. There's a self-defensive nature of that, they suggest. Although, of course, those were in response to Israeli operations at the time, rather than warnings of future strikes. So I think that's a bit cheeky as well. The key here is this a preemptive strike or is this a preventive strike? You might not know the difference. A preemptive strike is allowed. It's when there's an imminent threat of an armed attack from the other side. Imminent. A preventive strike is we're going now because we're expecting we're going to have a war somewhere down the future, and this is a good opportunity to start. This is the best time to fight a war that's going to happen. Trust us, this war is going to happen. So we might as well start it now. This is as good a time as any. That's preventive. But preemptive, it must be an imminent threat. Now I should say preventive strikes, not allowed under UN. As far as the UN Charter is going, that's illegal. Not that Israel, I think, really cares, but to the extent that anyone cares, it's an illegal war if you're undertaking a preventive war. But if it's a preemptive war, that is potentially illegal. This is why the intelligence is so important, and Marco Rubio thinks we should disregard. New intelligence showing that the Iranians were rushing to build a nuclear bomb would justify a preemptive strike. If they had intelligence saying, no, they're trying to build one right now, tomorrow there could be a nuclear bomb, and they have shown an intention to use that nuclear bomb, then that is a preemptive strike right then and there, completely legal. I don't see that intelligence. So from my point of view, this is clearly a preventive war, not a preemptive war. Could have happened any time. It could have happened in 2 weeks or in a month or in 6 weeks. They could have let diplomacy continue. There were other options. They chose not to use them. Illegal war is my view. Do you have a thought?
I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in international law and the laws around war. Everything you've said makes sense to me. But yeah, beyond that, not really.
Okay. So then we get to the American side of things, the War Powers Act. Now, presidents are allowed to commit US troops into combat in order to protect the lives of Americans and US interests. That is true. But the initial declaration of war has to be made by Congress. That's what the Constitution says, Article 1, Section 8. It's very explicit about that. Declarations of war are by Congress. The problem is, what's a war? Is a one-off strike a war? Is fighting for a couple of days and stopping a war? Is fighting for 2 weeks a war? What's a war? In the Constitution, they actually don't. They tend to talk about hostilities. Sorry. In the legislation, in the statute, the War Powers Act 1973, they refer to hostilities rather than war. So what's a hostility? And what about a hostility that inevitably leads to war? If you do one thing, that's going to lead to retaliation for sure, and then you have no choice but to continue because you're then in a war. Does the president have the right to start this highly provocative one-off act that will end up in a war? That's often the question. And some would say that was the question this time round as well. The War Powers Act says the constitutional powers of the president as commander-in-chief to introduce United States armed forces into hostilities are exercised only pursuant to 1, a declaration of war, or 2, specific statutory authorization, or 3, a national emergency created by attack upon the United States' territories or possessions or its armed forces. The same preemptive concept applies here as applies to the UN as well. If it's a preemptive situation, then that is considered to be a self-defensive attack that comes under number 3. So, were American lives being threatened by Iran directly at the time of the attack? No. Are there alternatives to military action? Yes. They were exercising them until the war. So that's not sounding good. Also, the president in every possible instance, this is a quote from the War Powers Act, the president in every possible instance shall consult with Congress before introducing United States armed forces into hostilities or into situations where imminent involvement in hostilities is clearly indicated by circumstances. Did the president consult with Congress before introducing the army into hostilities? No, there was no advanced consultation whatsoever. And it wasn't like, oh, we got no time. Oh, no, this happened 5 seconds ago. No, they were talking about this for a week. They had plenty of time to consult, chose not to. So you look at the wording there and you go, well, Trump clearly is breaking the law. These are clearly illegal strikes, except this law has been bastardized for years now by the definition of hostilities, which I flagged before. Clinton launched cruise missile attacks under Operation Infinite Reach on 2 continents in 1998, and they didn't think the hostilities counted for the War Powers Act. Obama in 2011, they said the only kinds of commitments that would make the War Powers Act relevant were those on the scale of the Vietnam War, in which we had 500,000 soldiers there, tens of thousands of lives lost, hundreds of billions of dollars spent. That's a pretty high bar to meet before you call it a war or hostilities, I would have thought. And they used that logic to claim that the 2011 operations in Libya, which went for months, by the way, weren't covered by the War Powers Act. That Obama did ask for congressional authorization to take military action in Syria in 2013. Congress refused to approve it. He did it anyway. In 2017 and 2018, Trump justified airstrikes against Syria over his use of chemical weapons. Same way. These weren't hostilities. No, these aren't hostilities. They're just one-off airstrikes. Same with the Houthis. They were fighting the Houthis for a good month, maybe 2 months, for a while there. Lots of airstrikes. No, they're not hostilities. No. By the definition that's been used the last 30 years, these are definitely not hostilities. One airstrike, that's not hostility by one airstrike on a nuclear facility is not an airstrike compared to what was going on in Libya. But I just don't, and a lot of people, what about Obama on that regard? Go, well, what about Obama? I think they're both wrong. I personally think all of them are hostilities. All of them can lead to greater conflict that can drag people. The whole point is to not start a war without Congress saying yes. And if you put Congress in a position where they have no choice but to say yes, because you've already commenced hostilities and then there's a chain of events, then that's completely flaying the Constitution. So I personally think that Trump did break the War Powers Act, and so did Obama, and so did Clinton. That's my take. But yeah, we do need to at least recognise that Trump has a lot of company here. There have only been 11 congressional declarations of war in American history. This is a country that's basically been at war its entire existence. There hasn't been a congressional declaration of war since 1942 in World War II. There have been 125 military campaigns since then. Not one was declared by Congress. Now, Congress has passed resolutions to approve of the president declaring war. They did that with Iraq. They did that with Afghanistan. But Congress has not declared war since 1942. So does the law no longer exist? Is it just effectively just off the books? I don't know. I hate the way this happens in America. Well, laws just don't seem to matter. It really just drives me crazy. And the Supreme Court hasn't helped because it's been their interpretations of the law that has allowed this to occur over time. This gradual creep to the point where just it might not even be on the books. Do you have views on this before I go into what the Democrats have been saying?
Just that it is like what we were saying with the TikTok ban earlier. Like once you let one president bend the rules on something, it creates a precedent, and all the ones that come next are going to do the same thing. And so that's always worth bearing in mind. I did also find it ironic that I read today, Iran, which is obviously a country where, the parliament is not a, serious parliament that, doesn't wield the power in Iran. I mean, had a parliamentary vote on Sunday to close the Strait of Hormuz, which they haven't done, but, giving themselves the option. And it's like, even Iran at least pretends to go through the motions of consulting their parliament before engaging in major military acts, which I just found, slightly ironic.
That's a great observation. That's true. That is, wow. You're right. That just shows how low the standards are in America these days of constitutional propriety. Anyway, so the bottom line is, I just don't think this is enforceable anymore. I think it's just they've just messed it up.
Yeah, the ship has sailed.
But it is clearly, just be very clear. I think there's no getting around the fact that the word of the law has been infringed here. But the ship has sailed, as you say. So we got some Democrats who are talking about impeaching Trump because of this. They disagree with me. AOC said the president's disastrous decision to bomb Iran without authorization is a grave violation of the Constitution and congressional war powers. He has impulsively risked launching a war. The main snares for generations is absolutely and clearly grounds for impeachment. Agree. And yet, I don't think, could you try to put some teeth on this by impeaching a president? Yeah, you could try, but no one's going to take it seriously. It's just too obvious a whatabout. For Obama in particular, oh my God, he was so loose with this. There's no doubt that Trump has not pushed this as far as Obama has. So if we're being fair. And Sean Casten, similar, this is not about the merits of Iran's nuclear program. No president has the authority to bomb another country that does not pose an imminent threat to the US without the approval of Congress. This is an unambiguous, impeachable offense. Yes, same diff. Now, look, to be fair to the Democrats, this is tough for them. This is a tough political situation for them because, especially if things like the way things are going right now, they might change. But even before right now, it was a tough situation because their take on Trump, their attack on Trump until recently was Taco Trump. And now all of a sudden they just flipped. Which is a bit difficult. You literally had, Chuck Schumer has a history of being pretty hawkish for a Democrat on Iran, generally speaking. And in fact, he recorded a video having a go at Trump for his negotiations only a couple of weeks ago.
When it comes to negotiating with the terrorist government of Iran, Trump's all over the lot. One day he sounds tough, the next day he's backing off. And now, all of a sudden, we find out that Witkoff and Rubio are negotiating a secret side deal with Iran. What kind of bull is this? They're going to sound tough in public and then have a side deal that lets Iran get away with everything? That's outrageous. We need to make that side deal public. Any side deal should be before Congress and, most importantly, the American people. If Taco Trump is already folding, the American public should know about it. No side deals.
Now he's saying no president should be allowed to unilaterally march this nation to something as consequential as war with erratic threats and no strategy. Now, to be fair, those two positions are consistent. I'm not saying they're inconsistent. I'm just saying thematically they clash. Thematically, his angle broadly, bear in mind that most people don't dissect wording like I do, going, oh, they said that word there and that word there. Most people just get the gut feel. And the gut feel of that video was Trump's soft on Iran. He's folding on Iran. And the gut feel now is you're too tough on Iran. You're like, we need to be careful. We need to think about this. And that's a difficult line it's a nuanced line to walk. I want to emphasize he is being consistent. There is no inconsistency here, but it's just tough to communicate. Hakeem Jeffrey's got a similar kind of issue, not quite as bad as Chuck Schumer, but a week ago, he's saying, our commitment to Israel's security is ironclad. It is clear that the Iranian regime poses a grave threat to the entire free world. There is no circumstance where Iran can be permitted to become a nuclear power. No circumstance. Now he's saying, President Trump misled the country about his intentions, failed to seek congressional authorization for the use of military force, and risks American entanglement in a potentially disastrous war in the Middle East. Once again, those two positions are consistent with each other. I'm sure they sat down and they looked at the original position and said, okay, how can we finesse this so that we can now be critical from the other side while still being consistent with our previous message? They are all consistent with each other, yet I could so see someone who wasn't paying much attention, which, let's face it, is everyone when it comes to Hakeem Jeffries, who isn't paying much attention, going, hang on, weren't they just taking the other side a week ago? What the hell? It's a tough situation for the Democrats to try and finagle, especially if Trump pulls it off. What are your thoughts?
I feel like, having just seen that Chuck Schumer clip for the first time, I'd be surprised if Democrats' arguments from a week ago had much cut through at the time at all, let alone any staying power. So I don't think that I wouldn't be too concerned about that for Democrats. I feel like how this issue plays is all going to be about how it unfolds. If it ends up being successful and limited, then it's going to be, something for the Trump administration to crow about, and they will over and over and over again for the rest of his term. And Democrats will probably just have to not say much about it and, try to prevent it from coming up as much as possible in the discourse, like just kind of ignore it, basically. But if it goes sideways, then Trump's going to own that, and no one's going to care what Democrats said a week before the war. So I think it kind of, Democrats are not that relevant to the sort of what they kind of have to say about it, before and right now is probably not really going to stick in the mind relative to what they say about it if and when it continues to develop in meaningful ways.
Yeah. Okay. My other big section I think we should talk about here is now let's take into consideration what happened today. Everything we know. What does this mean from here? Where are we going from here? Like, is this looking good? Is this just the beginning of a long war? Are we just gonna? There's just gonna be more strikes in the near future. Where are we going? Obviously, you've already said the main point, which is it depends how successful the hit was. Dan Kane said at the time, the final battle damage will take some time, but initial battle damage assessments indicate that all three sites sustained extremely severe damage and destruction. The Iranian media claimed that at Fordo, the underground place, only 2 entrances were damaged and that was it. IAEA said no increases in off-site radiation levels had been reported after the US strikes, for what that's worth, suggesting that at least something disastrous hadn't happened. Trump's statement right after the attack was all over the place. He said the main Iranian nuclear sites were completely and totally obliterated, but also it would take time to assess the damage. He said that the Iranian program had been totally destroyed, but he said there were many targets left. Who knows? The fact that Israel's prepared to agree to a ceasefire, to me, suggests that it's probably been dealt with to Israel's satisfaction at least, which is probably a higher standard than most of us have. So it would suggest that the nuclear issue may have been dealt with, but at the same time, like I said before, there were satellite images showing that I didn't mention this before, but I just showed that it would happen. There were satellite images showing 16 trucks parked outside Fordo before the strike. Iran certainly has claimed that they moved all the uranium before the strike. Israel has said, we've noted some interesting things about your uranium. like Netanyahu said, so I don't know the exact quote here, but it was, Netanyahu was very much suggesting, we know you've moved all the uranium and we know where it is. That is what he was suggesting. But everyone seems to agree that they haven't got the uranium. So there is uranium somewhere, which could be used in the dirty bomb, could be, who knows. Can they get the band back together? I don't know. Do you have any thoughts about where we're going from here?
No, just to reiterate what I said earlier, which is that I think it would be foolish to guess what's going to happen. I feel like I rattled through a number of the possibilities, and we kind of have to wait and see to an extent. Another kind of, factor which I didn't really raise before, but, and which I won't pretend to know enough about to really comment on. But, I think part of it, especially around that question of regime change, depends on, what kind of pressures and like appetite for change among different groups of people exists within Iran. And I'm not so much talking about popular uprisings so much as, are there people or factions in Iran, in the Guard Corps, in some other part of the country that, potentially sees an opportunity to seize power? And are they interested in that? These are the kind of things that can destabilize a country very quickly. But I don't know enough to know if that's, how much of a risk that is. Yeah, I just feel like we don't know what's going to happen from here. And there's a lot of risks. Doesn't mean that any of them are going to happen. None of the bad things might happen. That'd be nice. But but yeah, like we just have to wait, really.
Yeah. Yeah. I should also say as well, something that hasn't been talked about so much is that you literally could not remove all the nuclear program, everything, because there's a reactor at Bushehr a nuclear reactor, a live nuclear reactor that can be modified to generate plutonium that could be used for nuclear weapons. They can't strike that. It's a working reactor. They would have risked a Chernobyl-like situation if they struck that. And there's a city with 200,000 people right nearby. And by the way, if Israel or America attacked, or Israel in particular, attacked that nuclear reactor, then Iran would attack Israel's nuclear reactor for sure. And then, you'd have problems. So they can't get rid of everything. Oh, by the way, also, J.D. Vance explicitly said, we are going to work in the coming weeks to ensure that we do something with that fuel. And that's one of the things that we're going to have conversations with Iranians about. So he's just assuming they got the fuel out. I think a question which maybe right now, if I was doing my reading in the last few hours, I would see that everyone's talking about, but if they're not, they should be. This will be a question they will be talking about if they're not already talking about it. So I'm sorry if everyone's heard this to death already. But are there inspectors coming or not? That is, to me, the most important question. Is Iran letting inspectors in? Because one of the fears were that if they got bombed in Fordo, that they would withdraw from the name escapes me, the nuclear, the UN
non-proliferation
agreement. The non-proliferation treaty, that they would withdraw from the non-proliferation treaty, and then they would not allow inspectors to come in to verify exactly how damaged their program is. Are they going to let them in or not? They're not going to let them in. We have no way of knowing for sure where they're at. And that goes for America and that goes for Israel. So that's a big, big question. Are they going to let them in or not? There's a reason why the United States sent ground forces into Iraq in 2003. It's because Clinton bombed the hell out of Iraq in 1998, and afterwards they had no idea if it worked or not. You need people on the ground. So are those inspectors going in or not? That's a key question, I think, going forward. And potentially, I don't want to get ahead of myself here, but potentially that may be the source of some serious threats from Trump going forward. If not, actual resumption of hostilities if they don't let the inspectors in. Also, I mean, it was an interesting situation. I mean, this ceasefire does change things a little bit in that what I was getting all hot up to talk about was I couldn't believe the splitting of hairs from J.D. Vance about this after the strike, where we'll play the clip.
The big question, is the United States now at war with Iran?
No, we're not at war with Iran, John. We're at war with Iran's nuclear program, and I think the president took decisive action to destroy that program last night. We don't want to achieve regime change. We want to achieve the end of the Iranian nuclear program, John. That's America's objective, and that's what the president has set us out to do.
That was an extraordinary bit of sophistry, which I did get mocked about. I don't know how this happened. All I did was acknowledge that someone who is clearly very intelligent isn't a very intelligent person. And I've been tarred the rest of my life as every single time J.D. Vance says anything that's not Mensa level, people just go, oh, Chaz, oh. Anyway, so I've copped a lot of crap about him saying that, because that was a very interesting splitting of hairs there. But I will allow Tim Kaine to respond, because his response was perfect.
Well, the vice president was on another network earlier this morning and said, we are not at war with Iran. We are at war with Iran's nuclear program. There seems to be a lot of legal parsing on the definition of the word war here. What do you make of that description?
I think it's BS, and I think anybody hearing it would conclude the same thing. When you're bombing another nation, ask them if they think it's war. They do. Would we think it was war if Iran bombed a U.S. nuclear facility? Of course we would.
That's pretty common sense.
Yeah, I mean, also the fact that the sentence literally says, we are not at war, we are at war, is a bit contradictory. Yes. I mean, I understand the desire to signal we don't want to expand beyond this. This is the goal of this operation. We're not trying to get into a bigger thing, so let's try to avoid misunderstandings that result in unintentional escalations. I don't think that there's a total lack of value in what I think he's trying to communicate there, but he communicated it in very irritating phrasing.
Yeah, absolutely. And look, I mean, I was going to spend a lot more time on that and a lot of other things like that before the news of today, but I've turfed that because obviously Iran took it. So for Iran, if there was a question mark over whether Iran would take it, then we'd go into quite some detail. But they did take it, so America calculated correctly that would be good enough to not have an Iraq situation, at least in the short term. Let's see in the long term, but because there may be a resumption, and we'll see. But the fact is, what I do want to focus on is where Iran is coming from. Because I think that goes to why they might agree to a ceasefire. Iran's options weren't good. They really weren't good. Let's think about how they could retaliate. They could attack U.S. military bases, where there were 40,000 active duty U.S. military personnel supposedly stationed in the Middle East. But America knew this was coming. They evacuated Qatar already. They evacuated Bahrain already. Qatar was the one they ended up striking. Iran struck at, knowing it had already been evacuated.
And still warning in advance.
Yes, yeah, I know. But they wanted Qataris to be killed. Iran was not going to attack the Abu Dhabi base because UAE has control over hundreds of billions of dollars of Iranian assets that they could confiscate. So they weren't going to be doing that. So attacking US military bases, kind of pointless. What's the point? You're not going to cause any damage. You just might kill maybe one American. That will then be an excuse for America to thump you with. Next option, close down the Strait of Hormuz, which we already talked about. Their parliament gave permission to do that, for that to happen. The Strait of Hormuz would cut down 1/5 of the world's oil supply overnight. supposedly would send the world's oil prices through the roof, send the world into a worldwide recession. But the people who get hurt the most by that, China. They're the ones who buy all their oil from Iran. Iran would get hurt a lot as well. America, hey, it would get hurt. There's a worldwide recession, okay? It would get hurt. And oil prices go up around the world, not just in one place. But America isn't even a net oil importer. They're a net oil exporter. Now, yes, different kinds of oil. They need to import some kinds of oil because they export different kinds of oil. That is all true. My point is that America would be hurt less than, say, Europe and Asia and places like just, you're not going to be hurting America as much as you'd like by doing this. The biggest effect would actually be to help Russia fight the war in Ukraine, because if oil prices go up, Russia makes more money because they're a massive net exporter. So that'd be the biggest effect. But anyway, the fact is, it wouldn't be a big power move. It would be annoying. It would just get the rest of the world even more offside than they already are. And I don't think it would hurt America all that much. Like, I mean, they'd be fine. Lone wolf attacks. That's another option. Like, all their secret cells around the world, go, attack. It's kind of pathetic. That's not going to, I don't think that's going to make America lose a lot of sleep. I mean, it'll help Fox News program the next 3 months. But it's, I don't think that's going to be a fact. I don't think, from Iran's point of view, they're thinking, oh yeah, we'll get them back with some lone wolf attacks by a few crazy people going out and stabbing people. Yeah. Russia. This was the big one, Russia. There was a real weird moment when Medvedev came out, the bit of a saber rattler, Medvedev, and he said, what have the Americans accomplished with their nighttime strikes on 3 nuclear sites in Iran? 1, critical infrastructure of the nuclear fuel cycle appears to have been unaffected or sustained only minor damage. Well, Israel, I think, disagrees with that. 2, the enrichment of nuclear material, and now we can say outright, the future production of nuclear weapons will continue. Interesting that. We can now say it outright. 3, a number of countries are ready to directly supply Iran with their own nuclear warheads. What? This was J.D. Vance's response to Medvedev directly threatening to provide Iran with nuclear bombs.
This morning, the Russian reaction caught my eye. Dmitry Medvedev, of course, the former president and prime minister of Russia, now the deputy chairman of Russia's Security Council, said the enrichment of nuclear material, and now we can say it outright, the future production of nuclear weapons will continue. A number of countries are ready to directly supply Iran with their own nuclear warheads. What do you make of that Russian response? And are they off base? I mean, they're saying that the nuclear program in Iran is still well underway.
Well, first of all, I think it's a bizarre response, but I also don't know that guy speaks for President Putin or for the Russian government. One of the things that we've picked up, John, in our conversations with the Russians over the last few months, despite our many disagreements, of course, with the state of Russia, they've been very consistent that they don't want Iran to get a nuclear weapon.
That's interesting from J.D. Vance about they don't want Iran to get a nuclear weapon. I must say, I don't know if he's right or not, but if they were going to give Iran a nuclear weapon, why wouldn't they have already given Iran a nuclear weapon? Iran has been at this for a long time. So I feel like it feels like an empty threat. Also, Russia in the last few years wouldn't even sell Iran S-400 missile defense systems and Su-35 fighters. So they wouldn't sell Iran some hardcore equipment. Why would they give away a nuclear bomb? And then you got the foreign minister of Iran going to Putin, essentially begging him before this ceasefire. Clearly, they exhausted all the options before they finally gave up. And Putin gave him nothing. Putin gave him nice quotes that were like pats on the head. This absolutely unprovoked aggression against Iran is unjustified, said Putin. The Kremlin spokesman Dmitry Peskov said, there's been a new escalation of tensions in the region, and of course we condemn this and express our deep regret in this regard. But when they were asked what specific support Russia might offer Iran, Peskov said, quote, "It all depends on what Iran needs. We have offered our our mediation services." They might as well offer their meditation services.
Yeah, everyone chill out with some meditation. That's how we're going to fix it.
I think Israel could do with some chilling out. There's no doubt. So maybe they do need the meditation services, but like mediation services, that is not a nuclear weapon. So I don't think they're getting much from Russia either. I think that was a dream. So they're the only options I can see from Iran, what they can do. They're not good options. So I think they're in a position where they did rationally need to go for the ceasefire. And I was going to say that before this happened. So I'm a bit pissed off about that, which has happened the day after. Because I was going to say, I was planning to tell you all this beforehand and then say, I don't think Iran's in a good position here. I reckon they should go for a ceasefire. But anyway, so that's my take on this, that this is actually all very rational for Iran because I don't think they have any other options. What are your thoughts?
I agree. But yeah, part of the reason I was very apprehensive ahead of today is that, you can't always trust people to act rationally. And I'm not just talking about Iran. This is in lots of governments and other parts of, other powerful people around the world. You can kind of talk it all out and say, yes, this makes sense, but whether people are actually going to follow that path, because like we were saying, it kind of made sense to negotiate to prevent the bombing in the first place, and that didn't happen. So to be honest, I was not optimistic before today that that's where we were going to land, even though the arguments for it are sound, but I'm glad if that is where it lands.
Yeah. And I feel like you might have some final thoughts, but I feel like we've talked enough about Iran. Let's talk about some other stuff before we run out of time. But let me just say explicitly that I hope I'm wrong. I hope I was wrong about the strikes. I hope they worked. I hope that they did take out the nuclear program completely. I hope that there isn't another Iraq. And I'm more than happy to say, well, my judgment, while rational and reasonable, and I stand by my judgment, originally it was proven by events to be incorrect, and that the risk of Iraq did not pan out, and the risk of an Iranian nuclear program was avoided. So, great. Let's see. Today it looks a lot more likely that's the case than 3 days ago, but we will see. Do you have any final thoughts on Iran?
Yeah, just if we had done this podcast yesterday, you would have gotten a much more pessimistic version of me on all of these discussion points. And I'm in the exact same boat where I'm like, I hope that my pessimism was wrong, because just fewer people dying in the world is a good thing. So yes, it was not my instinct that this would go smoothly, and it may still not go smoothly ultimately, but I hope it does. Love to be wrong in this instance.
The thing that America always needs to bear in mind is that, which I don't think they do often, is the other side gets a vote. It's not just what America wants to do. It's not just what J.D. Vance wants to do. It's not just what Hegseth wants to do. It's what Iran wants to do. And the fact that if they have agreed to a ceasefire, that suggests that they are voting wisely. So good. And I've got an update here on the big beautiful bill. It polls terribly. That hasn't changed. Quinnipiac, 27% approval to 53% disapproval. Republicans in Quinnipiac with 67% approval to 10. That's not really good for a Republican bill, 67% approval. Independents, 20% approval versus 57% disapproval. 47% think federal funding for Medicaid should increase. 40% think it should stay about the same. 10% think federal funding for Medicaid should decrease. That's Quinnipiac. Washington Post, 23% support for big beautiful bill versus 42%. 34% have no opinion. By the way, they didn't mention the big beautiful bill there. They just described the bill. So that's even better from a polling perspective. So it's not about branding. It's about what it does, and people didn't like it. Amongst those who said they've heard a great deal or a good amount about the bill, 33% to 64%, but 66% said they had heard a little or nothing at all about the bill. So the Democrats need to get their message out a bit more, I would suggest. But people who hear the message, it's working. Now, I got two short updates on this. First of all, dynamic scoring. You might recall one of the main efforts to spin CBO scores, the Congressional Budget Office scores, in the past have come from Republicans insisting that CBO figures don't count because they don't do dynamic scoring. Dynamic scoring is when you budget not just in terms of basic revenue and expenses, but you take into account how those revenue and expenses will affect the economy, and then how that new economy will change the revenue and expense numbers. So it's like a cycle, how it feeds into itself. So basically they'll say, sure, the bill theoretically adds $2.4 trillion to the deficit over 10 years, but when you consider all the supercharged growth the economy is going to experience from this bill, you'll raise more revenue in taxes and that will close the deficit. This is how Mike Johnson put it.
The problem is they do not use what we call dynamic scoring. What that means in layman's terms is they don't give us any credit for the extraordinary economic growth that will be spurred along by this bill. This is a pro-growth package. Lower tax rates, less regulation. We'll do exactly what we did in the first Trump administration, but this time on steroids. And so we're going to have an extraordinary growth in the economy. You're going to have more jobs created, higher wages, more labor participation. And all those things need to be factored in because that's reality.
Guess what? The CBO performed a dynamic scoring analysis. Mike Johnson would be thrilled. And it found that the legislation would increase real GDP by 0.04% per year. Whee! That's 0.5 percentage point over 10 years. In total. Why so little? Because like I've told you many times, most of this bill is just maintaining the current tax rates. It's not letting them rise back to where they were before the jump. That's all it does. No, sorry, before Trump came in. That's all this does. It'll make no difference at all. Well, that's not true. It'll make some difference, just not to growth. The extra debt will make a difference. That will increase interest rates. In fact, according to CBO's dynamic scoring, it will add $441 billion in debt repayments over 10 years. So the net result is a $2.8 trillion increase in debt instead of a $2.4 trillion increase in debt. The dynamic scoring is worse. Mike. Paul Winfrey, former White House budget advisor, made an important point about this. He said, any deficit reduction from higher growth from now on is more than offset by rising interest costs on an already massive debt. Whether or not you accept CBO's growth assumptions, this is the trap we're in. The debt's too high. We have to cut spending. We simply can't grow our way out of this. We certainly can't inflate our way out without imposing a massive tax on the American people. The debt has gotten to the point now where it's so big that it is limiting your options in how you respond to the economy. Big time. Penn Wharton and Yale Budget Lab both also found the debt increase with dynamic analysis. By the way, you'll be shocked to know that Republicans have assumed this bill will increase growth by not by 0.04% per year, but by 0.8% per year, which is massive. Where they get from? Nowhere. I don't know where they get that from. It just sounds like a nice number. Well done, guys. Anyway, my point is that this applies to Republicans now, but it's going to apply to the Democrats next time around. Anything anyone does from now on is going to be limited by the debt. The debt is too big. You're getting to a position now where whatever you do, unless you are reducing the debt, you're going to make everything much worse. And there are going to be feedback loops that are going to be so damaging from here on in that are going to be a problem for both parties. So we should bear that in mind. Those figures are all based on the House bill, though, not the Senate bill. Senate bill's going to be different. They're going to be voting on that soon. I think maybe this week. Also, that doesn't include the extra revenue from tariffs. But if you throw in the tariffs, they will reduce growth and they will change the numbers for the worse probably as well. Talk about the Senate bill. Do you have anything to say about that before I talk about the Senate bill quickly, Melina?
Just that it's been well covered, but bears repeating. A separate CBO forecast a week earlier found the House bill would cause the lowest income households in the US to lose $1,600 a year in federal resources, while increasing resources by $12,000 for the highest income households. So this enormous addition to the national debt is all being done in the name of helping people who need it the least.
Yeah. That is a great point to make. Talking about the Senate bill, I should just go over the Senate version of the contempt provision, because we've talked about this terrible provision in the House bill several times now, which had nothing to do with taxes. They tried to condition a court's exercise of its contempt power on receiving a bond when a party seeks an injunction. That was already in the law, by the way. You always had to put a bond in when you were seeking an injunction, but judges until now have basically been charging $0 as a bond. This provision said you need to charge them something, not $0, or you can't enforce the injunction. The key was it was retrospective. No one cares about charging $1 in the future, but it applied to the past as well, which meant if there were injunctions that were passed in the past that didn't have a bond, they couldn't be enforced now. So all of Trump's injunctions, all of injunctions against Trump couldn't be enforced, at least not with contempt of court. It would have made all previous injunctions unenforceable. And to remind you, there have been over 300 lawsuits filed against the Trump administration. 187 of them have received injunctions from federal courts. And Trump won 7% of those cases outright. Not doing so well. So that's what this is all about. That's the House version. The Senate version is different. They've just gotten rid of the House version completely. But what they have said is that, and I'll just be clear, this needs to pass in the Senate. It needs to get 51 votes, which means it needs to get through the rules of reconciliation, which means it needs to be about the budget. We'll come back to that. But they said there's a requirement that plaintiffs suing the government post a bond from now on, not retrospectively, so it doesn't apply to any of the Trump injunctions. But from now on, they post a bond in an amount proper to pay the costs and damages sustained by the federal government. So no $1 bonds. However much it costs the federal government is how much you have to pay to play in the court. Going forward, you'll need to pay a high enough bond for any particular cost the federal government can come up with. So when calculating that sum, the Senate says, no court may consider any factor other than the value of the costs and damages sustained. So if you can't afford it, too bad. All that matters is the costs and damages to the federal government. To even have a chance of getting an injunction under those conditions, you need to pay a massive sum. So only the super rich, maybe state governments, will have the right to seek an injunction. But it actually gets worse. That sounds bad, but it gets worse. Because remember, you can't sue someone unless you have standing. So the state government can't just back you up. Let's say, for instance, you're the El Salvador dudes being sent to El Salvador without due process. The government says, well, this policy saves us tens of millions of dollars worth of court cases and processing and putting them up in jails and crime costs, maybe hundreds of millions of dollars. Can the migrants afford that bond to sue? No, they can't. So they go to California and say, can you guys sue on our behalf? California can't sue the federal government. This case has nothing to do with California. It has to do with only the individual who's been sent to El Salvador. California doesn't have standing. So in many cases, because of standing rules, it will be literally impossible to sue the government if they blatantly break the law. And you know what? Do you think that's bad enough? It gets worse again. Because the incentive here is for the government to impose the greatest cost possible on the bond to discourage people from suing, right? So what this will do is it will encourage the governments to break the law in such a flagrant and spectacular way that it will involve as many people as possible, so that the cost of changing the policy is massive, which will encourage greater malfeasance from the government in order to create effective immunity. What a perverse situation. So in summary, the government will be able to do whatever the hell they like, and the Constitution will become irrelevant because it will not be enforceable. Melina, any thoughts?
It's real bad.
Yes. It's an appalling provision. I can't believe they're even going for it. Like, how is this in their interest? There's going to be a Democrat president eventually. Do they think that there's never going to lose another election? Do they agree with the lefties who go, oh, this is our last election? Is that what they think? Because they must, because otherwise this is just dumb. Like this is going to cut both ways. It shouldn't get through the Senate because the parliamentarian, the independent umpire will rightly say this also has nothing to do with budgeting, which is one of the conditions. Sorry?
They have said that.
There you go. The question's going to be if they ignore the parliamentarian. That's going to be the question.
Although also I have to say I don't understand the parliamentarian rules, because the rules say that the legislation can only include proposals that directly change federal spending and not add to long-term deficits. And so this obviously has been flagged in that sense because it has nothing to do with the budget and deficits.
Yeah.
But aren't there heaps of things in the bill that don't pass that test? Like, I know they nixed one other thing on that basis, but and also it clearly adds to long-term deficits. Like, that's what the CBO is saying loud and clear. So it feels like quite arbitrary, the things that are and aren't allowed to be in a bill.
Yeah. Well, that's why the Republicans have their funny figures that they can rely on to say, well, we're actually saying it doesn't increase the deficit. We disagree with the CBO's analysis. That's why they have their 0.8% growth thing. So because with 0.8% growth, there's extra 0.8% growth, there's no increase in deficit. So that's their justification. It's a bit of a sad state of affairs. But the bottom line is the parliamentarian has no power. They're just expressing their opinion. The Senate decides with a vote what they're going to do. So are they going to ignore the parliamentarian in this respect as well? If they do and they pass it, I fully expect the courts to strike this down as an unconstitutional limitation of judicial review. But still crap. Don't do it. It's just crap. Now, Melina, we have 18 minutes by my count before your super hard deadline, which is 15 minutes later than the deadline you originally said. So thank you very much for that. I believe you were going to lead the RFK topic. So why don't you tell us all you can about RFK in 18 minutes?
Yes. So this is just an assortment of updates on ways that RFK is continuing to meddle with vaccines. I think covering approximately up to whenever we last talked about this on PEP. Yep. So he's chipping away at vaccine confidence in a lot of different areas, and it's clearly either a strategic, coordinated effort. He is playing, I think, a long game here as well. So I'm just going to rattle through all the ways, and we can, depending on the time we have left, talk about how we feel about it at the end. Yeah. One of the big ones is the changes he's made to the vaccine panel. So this is a panel of experts that get together and review the data on various vaccines and make recommendations, and those recommendations then flow through in many ways to what's covered by Medicare and Medicaid and insurance, and so it has big effects on access to vaccines in the community.
Yeah, the Medicare and the Vaccines for Children program literally have to cover the vaccines they recommend. And just for those who don't know, we're talking about the ACIP panel, which is the Advisory Committee for Immunization Practices. Okay, go on.
That's right. So on June 9, Kennedy announced on X that he would remove all 17 members of the ACIP panel, supposedly because they all had conflicts of interest, which is very defamatory because he didn't provide any evidence that they did. Yes. The one guy he did single out, Paul Offit, he talked about on Fox News, saying this guy had voted to approve a rotavirus vaccine before selling the patent for $186 million.
In 2002, the Government Oversight Committee held hearings about ACE that lasted almost a year, and they issued a scathing report about the institutionalized conflicts of interest and corruption. One of the examples they gave was that 4 out of the 5 members who voted to recommend the rotavirus vaccine to the schedule had a direct financial interest in that vaccine. One of those individuals voted to add it to the schedule, and then he subsequently sold his vaccine. He owned and developed with a guy called Dr. Paul Offit, sold his patent on the vaccine for $186 million. So he said he won the lottery because of his vote.
Mm-hmm. Now that sounds bad. That does sound like a conflict of interest. Until you know that vaccine expert left AKIP in 2003 and the vaccine was approved in 2006, and he developed the vaccine as an employee of a children's hospital. So the children's hospital owns the patent, not him.
Yeah.
So the one guy he's pointing to is not even part of this panel and doesn't actually have a conflict of interest.
Yeah, he's been chucking around an investigation from the year 2000 and a 2009 HHS Inspector General report as his entire evidence. And I don't think any of the AKIP panel were there then. So thanks, RFK.
So that's pretty shaky grounds to fire the whole panel. On June 11, he announced 8 replacement panelists. It's still unclear if he's going to add more, because there used to be 17. At least one of his new panelists does have a potential conflict of interest, which is Martin Kulldorff, who has been an expert witness in a lawsuit about the vaccine Gardasil, for which he charges $400 an hour and has racked up tens of thousands of dollars in consulting fees.
So, interesting.
If conflicts of interest is his driving concern, I don't know that he's achieved a great upgrade in the changes he's made to this panel.
And can I just throw in that at least 6 of the vaccine advisors that he fired have received a total of $80 or less from drug makers from 2017 to 2023.
Yes. Yeah, and there are all these rules and, about to specifically for this reason, because obviously you don't want to have conflicts of interest. And so, it's clearly a cover for wanting to change the ideological makeup of this advisory committee. Also, just as a quick side note, a CDC official overseeing COVID hospitalization data quit recently because she no longer believed the CDC will use data objectively. So we're seeing the kind of degradation of expertise in a number of different areas because of this sort of consistent attack on exactly that. So in terms of the vaccine recommendations that the panel is looking at, they'll vote soon on flu vaccines containing thimerosal, which is the preservative that's been blamed for the false connection to autism. That's usually what the people who say vaccines cause autism are usually pointing at thimerosal as the causal agent. RFK also says it causes brain damage, also without evidence. It's actually not very common in vaccines these days. It's a preservative, and they use it for when they have these sort of multi-dose vials, but most vaccines now come in single doses and don't require this preservative in there anyway. So still in some, but not many. And there are also alternatives in all the vaccines that it is used, there are alternative vaccines for the same conditions that don't use thimerosal. So it's not doomsday in terms of whether if they make a ruling saying you can't have thimerosal in vaccines anymore, it's not going to mean that a disease that we have a vaccine for will no longer have any vaccine, but it's also unnecessary to be removing things from the market that have been demonstrated safe. And it also, is part of this continuing effort to stir up doubt and fear around vaccines.
That meeting, by the way, is on Wednesday. It's tomorrow. So, yeah.
Another big change I don't think you've talked about on PEP yet, stop me if you have, is COVID vaccines no longer being recommended for pregnant women and kids in the US.
We haven't talked about that on PEP, no?
I feel like it's worth saying with this one, there's nothing wrong per se with that recommendation, because it does actually bring the US in line with countries including Australia and the UK. In Australia, it's not recommended for kids, healthy kids, without, immunocompromised issues or things of that nature, and pregnant women to get the COVID vaccine as a matter of course. And Kennedy's made that point, and he's not wrong in that respect. The issue is the way he went about it. So this occurred before he fired the AKIP panel, and he circumvented that panel to make this recommendation just on his own, basically. And in terms of the evidence he provided for the decision, rather than the reasoning that other countries had used, which is basically that COVID vaccines are safe for anyone who wants them, but not necessarily necessary to prevent severe illness in people who have already, especially people who have already had 2 shots, if we're talking about boosters, and people who are young or otherwise healthy. Instead of just making that argument, instead he's casting doubt on the safety of the vaccines, which again is not supported by good evidence. The Maha movement obviously supposed to be all about free choice for healthcare, but he doesn't just say, do what you want. He actively tries to undermine safety data with misinformation. And just as to back that up, the document he sent to Congress supporting the changes cites one study that's under investigation by its publisher for potential author conflicts of interest, and another study cited as a preprint that explicitly warns in the study that it hasn't been peer-reviewed yet and should not be used to guide clinical practice. So again, even when he's doing something that's not like inherently unreasonable, he does it in the most unreasonable way, and he does it in a way that is about stoking fear and using misinformation rather than actually assessing the facts that have the strongest evidence base behind them and coming to that conclusion. He almost comes to, I want to say the right conclusion, because there's nothing wrong with people getting COVID vaccines, but he almost comes to scientifically supported conclusions in spite of himself, rather than because he's actually trying to do that when it does happen. And the other thing I wanted to draw attention to was that when I was reading about this, I came across some recent polling on attitudes to vaccines, which I kind of found interesting. RFK, do you know what his approval rating is? And if not, would you care to guess?
Okay.
In a recent NBC poll?
I haven't seen it. I know he used to be the most popular person in the administration, like back in like January. I don't know about now. I'm just going to guess it's pretty similar numbers to what it was back then, which I'll guess, I think from memory, he had about a 52 or 53% approval back in February. So I have no idea what it'll be now. So I'll say 52%.
Very good. He's a 51% approval rating. Shah knows his stuff. I was surprised to read that. Probably just because I have taken an interest in RFK and have read so much about all the terrible things he's doing that I'm like, how has he still got majority support? But this poll also asked about views on vaccines generally, which I found interesting too. So they asked, in general, how would you describe your view of vaccines for the prevention of diseases? And 20% of respondents were opposed to vaccines for the prevention of diseases, which is upsetting.
Yes.
I would say. In terms of who approved, 93% of Democrats approved of vaccines for the prevention of diseases. 69% of Republicans, and 76% of independents. So it's becoming increasingly partisan, which I remember us predicting back when all the COVID vaccine, the partisan nature of that skepticism and hesitancy was becoming apparent, back in 2020 or 2021. And it's being borne out in the data increasingly that, vaccines just in the broader sense is becoming, not completely, it's not like, the numbers we see on other kinds of issues, but 93% of Democrats versus 69% of Republicans is not good. And 80% of Americans, 20% of Americans being opposed to vaccines just in a broad sense is really alarming.
Well, it is, because just to be clear to people here, when you say 20% are broadly opposed, that means on a specific basis for a particular vaccine, it'll be more. That means that the 20% is the bare minimum of opposition you're facing. And then some vaccines will be much more. There is no vaccine that I know of that can be successful from a herd immunity perspective with only 80% uptake. And that's the best case scenario there.
Yeah.
So that is definitely alarming.
And that's only going to get worse. We're at the beginning of this administration, and Kennedy is persistently out there saying things to undermine confidence in vaccine safety. Like just the other day, he was saying kids only, this is according to Kennedy, kids only got 11 vaccines in 1986 and now need between 69 and 92 vaccines before they're 18.
I've got the clip right there.
We've gone up from 11 vaccines in 1986. Today, children get between 69 and 92 vaccines before they're 18. Not one of those vaccines is ever...
It's really high. Those are not all mandatory.
Those are all mandatory. And the reason they're 69 to 92 is some of the brands require 3 doses, some of them require 4. But none of them have been safety tested, except for the COVID vaccine. The only vaccine on this schedule that has gone through placebo-controlled trials prior to licensure was the COVID vaccine. So nobody has any idea what the risk profiles are on these products. And we don't know whether they have anything to do with the epidemic of chronic disease. Almost all the chronic disease, these are products that are designed to deregulate your immune system, to change your immune system for life. And we are now having an epidemic of immune dysregulation in our country, and we don't have an idea, but we have to investigate to see whether that has anything to do with it.
Is that not true, Melina?
No,
is that not true?
You will be shocked to learn that that is not true. In reality, it's more like 54 to 58 vaccines.
Yeah.
Over the course of 18 years, not all at once. We're not putting 58 shots in a baby. And it's more like 35 if you're not getting the flu and COVID shots every year, which honestly, probably most kids aren't. And also, more to just insinuate that there's something scary and dangerous about the number of vaccines being given to kids increasing is absurd. More vaccines is a good thing. It means we're treating more diseases. Like kids used to get 0 vaccines, and a lot more of them used to die from the preventable illnesses that we now have vaccines for. Just the way that he kind of just vaguely insinuates harm without, and by throwing around numbers, it's just, I think, so insidious and is just, we're already starting from a bad place and it's just going to get worse and worse. It really concerns me.
But that clip we just played, he's even going further. It's not just the number, but he's also he's not just saying a big number equals scary, which he does do all the time, but that the heavy implication that the vaccines are responsible for all these immunity issues. It's so dodgy. He's just heavily implying, he's become very, very subtle with his wording to impart maximum negativity while giving the minimum possible exact wording elements to hang him with. He knows what he's doing. It's so infuriating.
Yeah.
And then, not to mention, by the way, after spending years ranting about how awful the COVID vaccine is, he now is citing it as the gold standard of evidenced vaccines, which I find very weird. But most of all, how bad do you have to be in terms of misinformation before Martha McCallum on Fox News will go, hang on, is that true? The fact that she is clearly skeptical about that stat, that says it all. It's just, oh God.
But also so many people do buy it. I didn't note down who this was, but I heard an interview the other day on, I think it was the New Yorker podcast, with a guy who was coming from a left-wing perspective, who was not an RFK fan, but he'd kind of read his books trying to understand him better. And he was making this point where he was everyone says RFK is anti-science, but if you read his book, he actually loves science. He cites all these scientific studies and all this detail, and he really loves science. He just misunderstands it or something. I'm just that's like saying Trump loves the law because he's always looking at the law trying to find ways to not follow it. It's not really in the spirit of loving the thing when you're only looking at it to back up your own gut vibes and you're 100%. Ignoring the actual scientific weight of evidence in favor of anything you can cherry pick to make a point, even if it's totally wrong or just something AI made up.
Yeah, I was gonna say it's like saying Trump works at 5:38 because he just keeps on making up polls. Yeah, like it's I 100% agree. I should also say, by the way, on that shot thing about the placebo-controlled experiment thing, study thing. Bill Cassidy, who I might bring up in a second, maybe after you're gone, he noted that only the first vaccine for a disease actually requires to be proven safe through a placebo-controlled trial. When you update the vaccine, it's already been proven safe. If you just do a minor tweak, you don't need to do it again. And so the reason why most of those vaccines are not, inverted commas, have undertaken placebo-controlled safety trials, as RFK puts it, is because their first vaccine did, and now we're in version 24 of that vaccine. It's been established that it's safe many, many, many times before. So they need to keep on running placebo-controlled trials.
And it would be unethical to give someone a fake polio vaccine.
Yes,
in that context, and sort of see if they get polio or not. If you that's just standard in medical research. If you have a treatment that works, then you do a comparative study rather than a placebo study. This is not unusual. This is how it is supposed to work for a really good reason.
And by the way, that clip we played and all we've talked about since is in the context of him. He was there talking about why AKIP is untrustworthy. The man is fundamentally untrustworthy, even when he's trying to explain why other people are untrustworthy. His Maha report, I haven't mentioned this on PEP. We did a thing on this on Planet America. It was written by AI. They left the stems of the links to their supposed sources. Like the stems had AI references on them. And what that tells you is not just that they were heavily influenced by AI when they wrote that report, or AI wrote it entirely, but also they didn't even bother to go back and check their references. Because if they'd gone back to check the AI generated references, they would have seen it says that it's generated by AI. So they clearly never even checked their own report that was written but largely by AI. It's just so untrustworthy, so dodgy. You got to go. So, Melina, thank you so much for your time and for guiding me through, because I'm in no state to do this by myself. So really, really appreciate it. And we will see you for a Melina Monday eventually.
Yes, on a real Monday.
Yes. Until then, thank you so much, Melina. We'll see you soon. Stay peppy.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
And I'll see you other guys on the other side of the White Flash. Welcome to the other side of the White Flash. I just got a couple of more things to say about RFK. Hello, Lockie.
Hello,
nice
I'm
to see
here.
you there.
Hi. Chaz, go.
Yes. A couple more things about RFK, and then I'll just do a little bit of immigration. Melina was pretty kind to that new board. The people who RFK announced as highly credentialed scientists, leading public health experts, and some of America's most accomplished physicians. All of these individuals are committed to evidence-based medicine, gold standard science, and common sense, he said. There's a guy called Robert Malone who is turned up on Tucker Carlson and Glenn Beck shows a lot. He was an early researcher into mRNA technology, which makes him a valuable critic of mRNA vaccines today. Big promoter of hydroxychloroquine and ivermectin to treat COVID. Went on Joe Rogan in 2021, said being vaccinated makes you more likely to get COVID. Bit of an InfoWars favourite. He said COVID was a symptom of a larger conspiracy to reorganise society towards global communism and to deindustrialise and depopulate the world. Recently, he wrote that people should embrace being called anti-vaxxers, as he has done, and he opposed the madness of the vaccine mania that has swept public health and government. One day after he said that, about people should embrace the term anti-vaxxers, RFK wrote, none of these individuals will be ideological anti-vaxxers. Interesting fellow, interesting situation. Retsef Levy, his pinned post on Twitter says, the evidence is mounting and indisputable that mRNA vaccines cause serious harm, including death, especially amongst young people. That's been his pinned post on Twitter for 2.5 years.
Uh-oh.
So that gives you an idea where he's coming from. By the way, for the record, post-vaccination myocarditis is considered less harmful than post-COVID myocarditis. Just as an aside. considerably less harmful. Then there's Vicky Pebsworth, who's on the board of the National Vaccine Information Centre, which is basically an anti-vax group. There was already Martin Kulldorff, who Melina talked about. Cody Meisner is opposed to COVID vaccine requirements for children and spoke out against masking them. That's not unreasonable, to be fair. But my point's not that everyone on this board's a crank. Some of them are okay. My point is it's pretty clear what RFK was going for when he was picking people. And they are people who express skepticism about COVID vaccines. That's kind of obvious. The other thing I was going to say is Bill Cassidy, I mentioned. He's the head of the health committee. He was the chair of the health committee, the Senate Health Committee, that confirmed Kennedy in February. But the thing about Cassidy is he's a doctor who was a leading light in vaccines before he became a Republican politician. And so there's a lot of pressure on him. And by the way, he was a casting vote. Without him, Kennedy doesn't get up. But he said, if confirmed, Kennedy will maintain the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention's Advisory Committee on Immunization Practices recommendations without changes. That was a guarantee he got. And then Kennedy just fired them all. Yeah, it's true. He didn't. He still followed. He's going to follow their recommendations after he's fired them all. So that's interesting. Cassidy hasn't explicitly said whether he feels Kennedy violated their agreement or not. But he's also spoken with Kennedy. Actually, I got the quote from Semaphor's Burgess Everett about that. Semaphor's Burgess Everett says, I asked if RFK Jr. had reassured him. Cassidy said, I'd rather just characterize it as we had a conversation. I also asked if he was still comfortable with his vote confirming RFK Jr. I'd rather not comment on that, said Bill Cassidy. Now, the thing you got to remember, you might go, what was the story of Bill Cassidy? Why did he confirm him? Bill Cassidy is running for re-election in 2026 and he's facing a primary opponent. That's what's going on here. So he basically was happy to inflict RFK on the vaccine community and, in fact, on America as far as health goes, in return for not getting a primary opponent. Guess what? Looks like he's getting a primary opponent anyway. So he's screwed, and Bill Cassidy has screwed over the health well-being of America anyway. So right. There you go. Just one more thing about that. Ironically, during COVID, AKIP actually recommended against some of the COVID vaccines, at least some of their usages for kids and stuff like that. CDC Director Walensky overruled them. So contrary to what RFK suggests, they were actually on RFK's side. Well, completely, just a little bit during COVID. And now he sacked them all. So there you go. Serves them right. Okay, now I've got 7 minutes left. I'm going to do an immigration update. I've always had too much immigration. There's some immigration stuff I've been hanging on to for a month. But let me just go through all the ways ICE are awful as quickly as I can. Masks. I've been complaining for weeks about ICE getting around without any uniform, no badges, no visible faces, not answering any questions, roaming around like Trump's secret police. I'm going to keep on complaining about it too, Lockie. I reckon Democrats should be going even harder than they are on this. They're going a little bit hard. They should be going real hard. But to be fair, we should note the reasons they say they're wearing masks. Whenever someone complains about the identity of an ICE officer being hidden, ICE tend to respond the same way. ICE officers are now facing a 413% increase in assaults. So that's why they need to hide their identity so they don't get doxxed and assaulted. And their families too. In fact, now they're saying it's a 500% increase in assaults. And look, I don't think that's a good enough excuse. The police don't hide their identity. Why should ICE? Even if they were worried about being doxxed, that might be a reason to hide your face. What's the reason for not showing your badge when people ask you? And what's the reason for not having an identifiable badge number? You don't need identity for that. But it gets better because Philip Bump had asked ICE for some more details about these assault numbers. Because, of course, 500% increase means nothing on its own. That could be an increase from 2 assaults to 10. So far, ICE are simply refusing to provide the actual numbers, which should tell you something in itself. But I think what makes the whole stat seem particularly sus, when they're trying to keep as percentages, I don't see why ICE should be any more under threat than, say, Customs and Border Patrol. They actually perform the same tasks often. Look at the graph of Customs and Border Patrol, because they, by legislation, have to put out these stats, unlike ICE. And their assault numbers have gone down 20% this year so far. Isn't that interesting? So Bump went looking for any news coverage at all of assaults involving ICE officers under Trump, and he found 12 assaults. 5 of them were targeted at ICE facilities, not the individual officers, and then the rest were targeted officers. Now, obviously, there's going to be more than 12 assaults. I'm not suggesting there's only 12 assaults. But this is while they're arresting 66,000 people. So you'd need an awful lot more unreported assaults to make this a genuine issue. Also, he noted almost all the assaults were while they were trying to arrest someone. They weren't officers being doxxed and assaulted away from the job. In fact, there may not be any doxings for all we know. ICE have provided none, 0 when asked. Check out how they reported the 500% figure in Breitbart. Have a look at this. This is my favourite, Tricia McLaughlin, as always. She's quoted as saying, ICE law enforcement is now facing a 500% increase in assaults while carrying out enforcement operations. While carrying out enforcement operations, not being doxed away from enforcement operations. So why are they hiding their identities? We have no answer. Next thing, ICE avoiding oversight. ICE's insistence on avoiding all forms of accountability and oversight, they get even more brazen. The further Consolidated Appropriations Act says that DHS may not prevent a member of Congress from entering for the purposes of conducting oversight any facility operated by or for the Department of Homeland Security used to detain or otherwise house aliens, or to modify the facility in advance of such a visit. DHS cannot require a member of Congress to provide prior notice either of the intent to enter a facility. That's all law. Congressional staff must give at least 24 hours notice, but the members of Congress can turn up anytime they like. Okay. ICE have released a new guidance on facility visit and engagement protocol for members of Congress and staff. Allow me to read it. ICE detention locations and field offices are secure facilities. As such, all visitors are required to comply with identity verification and security screening requirements prior to entry. When planning to visit an ICE facility, ICE asks requests to be submitted at least 72 hours in advance. Oh, really? How can they possibly justify this when the law says the opposite? They say ICE field officers are not detention facilities and fall outside of the law's requirements. Let me read you the original law again. They may not prevent a member of Congress from entering for the purpose of conducting oversight any facility operated by or for the Department of Homeland Security used to detain or otherwise house aliens. They don't have to be detention facilities. Are they used to detain or house aliens at all? Then they're covered. Also, the new rules also say that members of Congress may not bring in cell phones or recording devices. They must be escorted by ICE staff at all times, and they may not have any physical or verbal contact with any person in ICE detention facilities unless previously requested and specifically approved by ICE headquarters. So much for oversight. And Democrats are already being turned away. Chai Garcia tweeted he wasn't allowed into a facility where we have reports that immigrants are being detained here without access to their attorneys, sleeping on the floor, and without food. DHS responded with, Congressman, all members and staff need to comply with facility rules, procedures, and instructions from ICE personnel on site. Jerry Nadler and Dan Goldman were turned away from an office in Manhattan where detainees were being kept. They were told even though migrants were being kept on site, ICE was simply, quote, housing them until they can be detained. Let me read you the law again. Any facility operated by or for the Department of Homeland Security used to detain or otherwise house aliens. These guys are completely allergic to accountability, even budgetary accountability. I know they're about to be swimming in dough after the big, beautiful bill passes, but they've already outspent their budget by $1 billion with 3 months left in the fiscal year. Trump is moving as much money from other programs into ICE as he possibly can, which is, of course, completely illegal. And it's not like there's some surprise reason why they went over budget. They went over budget because psychos like Steve Miller are insisting on a quota of 3,000 arrests every day, even though they'd be lucky to come across 500 criminals or people with deportation orders. I'm not going to get to that. That's why their conditions are so bad, by the way, and their detention facilities are overcrowded and over-budgeted. But once again, they just don't care. They'll just spend as much money as they want, they'll just refuse accountability. They refuse oversight. They refuse to even acknowledge who they are. Just come and get us is their attitude. And I am going to have more to say about this the next time I talk about immigration, which is going to be the next PEP, because I have so much immigration to get through and we are out of time. So, Lockie, thank you very much for sitting there and smiling. You were a pleasant face. I will maybe see you in the studio on Thursday when we record the final PEP of this bracket, or I might be on Zoom again. We will see. I believe we have Jared Monshine coming. It should be lovely. Until then, stay peppy.
See ya.